'Twas the night before Christmas, and deep in the house a creature was stirring, ready to pounce. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, whilst phantom footsteps ascended the stair. The children were nestled, all snug in their beds, but a dark shadow figure loomed over their heads. And Mama in her kerchief, and I in my cap, were about to be woken by one ghostly rap.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And Merry Mince Pies, you're listening to the Christmas episode of Knock Once for Yes.
It is rapidly rolling up on the big day for those of you who celebrate Christmas, and we hope that all of you are having a wonderful holiday season. We've been frantically scrambling to get everything prepared in time, not least this episode, which is entirely my fault, and it's a good lesson in why I can't be trusted to do everything by myself, which you will soon see. As is now traditional in the final days of the year, it is time for the Knock Once for Yes Christmas special, with all the fun and excitement that entails. And this time somewhat of a monster of a paranormal postcard. So get your crackers at the ready, stand by to don your party hats, and brace yourselves for some terrible, terrible jokes.
It's not really Fitz's fault, guys. But Fitz, what have we got coming up on today's episode?
We've got an update on the creepy dolls washing up on a Texas beach, and a ghost cow on the paranormal radar. We have listener stories from Alyson, Bob and Cody. We'll be giving you a detailed rundown of why I shouldn't be left unattended in charge of planning, as we share our Christmas comedy of errors from Lincoln Castle. And of course, just in case you thought we might have forgotten, we have the terribly cheesy, but always fun, Knock Once for Yes Christmas quiz.
Yes, Christmas quiz. But before we get stuck into all of that, we want to say welcome and a huge thank you to our latest patron, Roland Belstead.
And to Kate for making a donation through coffee.
Thank you so much to all of our patrons, Repod and coffee supporters, old and new. We truly couldn't do this without you, and it means the world that you choose to support us in continuing to share our strange and spooky adventures in the paranormal. Now, Fitz, before we get to our first Christmas quiz question, what's pinged the paranormal radar today?
Well, our first paranormal radar story is an update on the creepy dolls that were washing up on a Texas beach that we talked about back in episode 63. The last we heard, John Oliver, host of Last Week Tonight, had bought all the remaining dolls to prevent the mutated terrors of the deep from escaping into the wild. Since then, he's been looking for a way of safely disposing of them, and he thought he'd found the perfect solution when his team came across a recycling centre in Yarra, Australia, whilst doing another story. Last Week Tonight kindly donated $10,000 to the town's local food bank, and $5,000 to the John Oliver Koala Chlamydia Award, don't ask, on the agreement that they would name a recycling facility after John and agree to process the demonic flotsam. All was going to plan, but unfortunately, after the opening of the John Oliver Recycling Centre in Yarra, they discovered that the dolls were the wrong type of plastic and could well damage the recycling machines in the newly opened facility. Would then the barnacled monstrosities now haunt the Last Week Tonight offices for eternity? No. Salvation was to arrive in the form of a rather normal-looking public waste bin in Sweden. You see, the city of Malmö in Sweden, incidentally and entirely unrelatedly the home of Nina Persson, lead singer of 90s pop rock band The Cardigans, had caught the attention of Last Week Tonight with a programme that they had implemented to encourage people to throw away their waste responsibly. They had done so by installing waste bins that thanked people for depositing their rubbish, only for some reason they did so using a rather husky female voice with somewhat carnal connotations. When Last Week Tonight contacted them to see if they'd be happy to accept the salty succubi of the surf using their sultry-voiced bins, they were more than happy to, but they did say that the bins no longer talked, as it was only a temporary summer event. But they were still capable of talking if they were to be reprogrammed. And this is how I came to find myself watching a video of Nina Persson, lead singer of the 90s pop rock band The Cardigans, feeding plastic nightmare babies into a Swedish waste bin, whilst it, in Swedish, commented, "Rest now, garbage babies, your demon days are over," and "Sleep well, the time has come for you to haunt God in space. Die, please."
What?
Yep, there is another sentence I never thought I'd write. As usual, I'll put the link to the video in the show notes on the website, but do be warned that there is a little bit of salty language, so you might not want to watch it at work.
Well, we've reported on some things on this show.
Indeed.
And we've said some sentences that I never thought we'd say. But I think that takes the prize.
It was one of those, how did my life come to this point moments.
What a way to end the year. Well, I've actually got a little Paranormal Radar update for you. You may remember that last episode we had a story about a ghost chicken, and I was thrilled because I love weird and wonderful ghosts, the really unusual cases. I'm always on the lookout for them. And animal ghosts particularly I find very interesting. So the idea of a ghost chicken thrilled me to bits, and I was so hoping that somebody out there would have ghost stories of another kind of animal, another one that you might not expect, say one that isn't a pet. Something like a farmyard animal, maybe a sheep or a cow. Lo and behold, one of our listeners got in touch to say that in all seriousness, they have genuinely seen a ghost cow, and this blows my mind. This is from Verity, who says, "When I was about 10 or 11, we moved to Tottenham and I would spend a lot of time in our local park, the museum, or the rather haunted cemetery. One day I was on my way to the play area. I decided to go the long way rather than through the park. I decided to go around the park and past the cemetery instead. The park was quiet. I don't remember there being anyone else around, but I heard a noise coming from across the road, coming from the cemetery. And there, through the trees, I saw a cow. Now, bear in mind, this is a built-up area in North London of all places, but there was a cow in the graveyard just chewing its cud, chilling between the headstones. I knew it couldn't be a real present-day cow, not in a built-up area of London of all places, and sure enough, when I looked again, it was gone."
Wow.
I know, how amazing is that? I love that. Honestly, please, somebody find me a ghost sheep. Because I've always wondered, why do you get ghosts of things like pets? You know, we know there are ghost cats and ghost dogs, ghost horses. People don't generally see animals like cows and chickens and sheep.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because,
What?
and this leads me in to the Knock Once vs Cheesy Christmas quiz, because...
Because are we having our first quiz question?
We're going to have our very first quiz question, because
Okay.
it just ties in so well. Like, you've led me into it perfectly.
Okay, I had no idea this was happening. Go on.
So, as you said, last episode we heard Caroline's story of the ghost chicken of Maryland, and it seems that we have our own ghost chicken here in the UK.
Do we?
Apparently so. Can you tell me where this ghost chicken is to be found? And I'll give you a bonus point if you can tell me which famous name is associated with it. And I'll give you a second bonus point if you can tell me what happened to them as a consequence.
Wow. Okay, that is a lot to think about. So, this episode, we're going to have to do something a little bit different. Normally, we have one question at a time.
Mm-hmm.
But this time, we've fluffed up. We've fluffed up the way we've written the episode. And we've got too many questions for the amount of segments that we have. So, we're going to have 2 questions at once. Then we're going to have a time to think about it while we have a story.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're going to both give our answers in the next question. Okay, so time for my question to you.
Okay, bring it on. I hope they're not going to be as evil as they normally are.
Well, the one that you just gave me was pretty evil, so, you know.
It was themed. It was perfectly themed.
It is very true. And I am really genuinely interested to hear the answer, so that's cool. Okay, my question to you. One of the biggest UK paranormal podcasts of this year has to have been the BBC's The Witch Farm, a deep dive into the incredibly strange haunting of Hale Vannog farmhouse in the South Wales Brecon Beacons National Park. But can you tell me, how did the ghosts of Hale Vannog cost the haunted family a fortune?
Oh, I should have listened to that, really, shouldn't I?
Well,
I presume that might have helped with this question if I'd actually listened to it.
It would have done, but this is a famous case that we both knew about before that podcast, to be fair.
Okay, not ringing any bells, but I shall have a think.
It's a really famous case that I know you've heard of before because of this particular thing I'm asking you about.
Okay.
So you should have a fighting chance.
I'll have a think while we have our first story, and then I'll have a guess. But while I'm thinking about it, it is time for our first listener story of the episode, and this one is from Alyson.
About 15 years ago, I shared a terraced house with a friend in a little town in East Anglia, which had been built sometime in the 1800s. My friend at the time had a steady boyfriend, so more often than not, I was on my own in the house, which didn't bother me, as I had lived on my own in an apartment before. I had a pet cat called Ziggy, who was an indoor cat, as she was a pedigree, and cats often went missing around our way, so Ziggy didn't go out of the house. One night, I was on my own watching a movie. My friend was staying over at her boyfriend's house when Ziggy came running into the sitting room where I was and hid behind the sofa. She stayed behind there for a short while, then slowly inched out and kind of looked towards the sitting room door. I assumed a neighbour's cat had come in, as I could leave the doors and windows open without having to worry about Ziggy going outside. So I went to investigate and found no windows or doors open or any stray cats in the house. She kept sticking her head out and then hiding back behind the sofa for about 40 minutes before she was brave enough to walk back towards the door. But then something made her jump, and she ran straight back behind the sofa again. To be honest, after a while this did begin to freak me out a little, so I went and sat on the second or third stair step and kept calling her to come to me as it was time for bed. I did begin to lose my patience as she wouldn't come out of the sitting room. In the end, she did come to the foot of the stairs where I sat and just looked up past me to the landing. There were about 15 stairs up to a small landing which turned left, then went up another 3 stairs to the 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. She just sat there, staring over my shoulder. And I don't know why I did, but I leaned to one side to block her from whatever it was she thought she could see. She then moved to the other side to see past me. Now this really did freak me out. I took a deep breath and, telling myself not to be scared and repeating to myself, "There's nothing there. There's nothing there," I turned around. Of course, there was nothing there. I managed to grab Ziggy and ran up the stairs. She was scared stiff. As I ran, she started to shake, and as soon as I got into my bedroom, she ran straight under my bed and refused to come out. I don't know what she saw, but she stayed under my bed for 3 days. She'd always slept on my bed on the pillow next to me, but for those 3 nights she didn't move from under the bed. About 5 months later, we got a friend of ours to move in with us to help pay the bills. We converted one of the downstairs rooms for her. After a week or so, she admitted that she didn't like being in the house on her own and thought she heard movement on the stairs at night when we were all asleep. My other housemate admitted that nearly every night when she was in her bedroom, she heard footsteps on the last 3 stairs, but thought it was because she was on her own in the bedroom for the first time ever and her imagination was working overtime. We had a radio in the bathroom, and one day I came home from work and one of my housemates said that someone had left the radio on all day as it was on when she got home from work. None of us remembered leaving it on. The next day we were all about to leave for work when my other housemate remembered something she'd left in her bedroom. I ran up the stairs to collect it for her, and upon getting up all the stairs, I could hear the radio playing. Now I know for certain I turned it off, because at the time it was playing a song I really didn't like, so I couldn't wait to turn it off. But when I got home later that night, my housemate told me the radio was on again. When I went upstairs to change my clothes, I could hear the radio playing. When I'd finished changing, I went downstairs and said to my friend, "You're a fine one to complain about leaving the radio on. It was left on." She turned to me and said, "Very funny. No, it's not. I turned it off. Don't try and wind me up." Later that night, we were all in my bedroom trying to fit some new blinds over the window, when all of a sudden, the radio in the bathroom came on full blast. It was so loud, the sound was distorted. The three of us just stared at each other. Not too long after that, we decided to move out. When moving day came, one of my housemates, Nan, came to give us a hand, and upon locking up for the last time, she turned and said to us, "I don't know what it is, but I had a real horrible feeling that something nasty happened on the landing in your house. I'm glad you've moved out of there."
And thank you to Alyson for sharing that story. I think we've had almost everything of your story happen to us at one time or another. Not necessarily at
in the same house. No, I was just going to say, but all in different houses with different cats in different sort of fragments. But yeah.
I think everyone with cats has had the weird thing where they look at stuff, although not necessarily to the terrified,
not to that extent
state that you described. I've had the radio stuff happen to me before.
Yes, you have actually, haven't you?
Yeah,
and
not plugged in, no batteries, but yeah, blaring radio. I've had that happen.
But was it only the once you had it happen, wasn't it?
I think so. I think it was just that one time, yeah.
Yeah, and our cat now in the house that we're in, I think we talked about this on the show before, she literally does stand at the bottom of the stairs and look at something.
And yowls at it.
And talks to it.
Well, this is the thing, because cats don't really talk to each other. They only talk to people, as far as I understand.
Yeah, I've read that. It's kind of like a weird sort of evolutionary thing that they've developed to sort of cohabitate with humans, isn't it?
They use more body language with other cats. But she'll know that if we're both sat in the living room and she'll know that we're both sat there, she'll go and sit in the hall, stare at the top of the stairs, and yowl.
Your cat impression.
Or she's not, the sweetest voiced cat when
oh, bless her.
She can be, but when she's talking to whatever it is at the top of the stairs, she's definitely talking some kind of weird something.
Weird language.
Yeah. Like elder cat summoning spell. Charlie says.
I was going to say, now you just sound like Charlie says. But before we get into our next ghost story, I think we need to give the answers to our quiz questions. So, I really have no idea about this ghost chicken. We've got one in the UK.
Yes.
And there's somebody associated with it that's famous.
There is somebody famous associated with the ghost chicken. And you get a bonus point if you can tell me where you can find the ghost chicken, the famous name that's associated with it, and an additional bonus point if you can tell me what happened to the famous person as a consequence.
Okay, I'm not going to get any of those points because I have no idea. I'm going to take just for a wild stab in the dark. I'm just going to guess a place.
Okay.
Off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm.
Like Birmingham. I don't know.
I'm afraid it wasn't Birmingham.
No, I know it wasn't.
It was London. Pond Square, Highgate, N6 to be precise.
Uh-huh.
And the famous name associated with it was Francis Bacon.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What happened?
I shall tell you the story. So apparently, Sir Francis Bacon wanted to test his hypothesis that refrigeration would be a good method for preserving meat. So, on a January morning in 1626, he bought a chicken, slaughtered and plucked it and stuffed it with snow. Since then, there have been several reports of what appears to be the ghost of a plucked chicken that runs around Pond Square flapping its wings before disappearing again. Reports are much less frequent now than they used to be, but the last specific reports were in the 1960s when a motorist whose car had broken down spotted it, as well as a couple in the 70s whose romantic moment was spoiled by the ghost chicken falling from above them and startling them when it landed next to them.
What?
Now, as to what happened to Sir Francis, he died.
Oh, no.
He caught pneumonia whilst carrying out the experiment,
Oh, no.
was taken to the nearby Arundel house to recover, but unfortunately he was placed in a damp bed, which didn't help matters, and he passed away a couple of days later.
Oh, no.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's so much to unpack here. For a start, well, I guess the main thing that I'm taking away from this is a motorist saw the ghost of a plucked chicken running around in the 1960s.
Yes.
Now, you see, I can understand how the story of what happened to Francis Bacon for his contemporaries could have spawned a ghost story about the ghost of a plucked chicken.
Yes.
But for that to continue into the 60s for some random motorist to like, that's not something you're going to project from your subconscious, is it?
You wouldn't have thought. It's an unusual one, to be sure.
I mean, there's so many cases where, a motorist is driving down a dark road and they spot what looks like a figure. But the thing is, your brain is expecting to see figures, especially when you're driving, you're looking out for people. Therefore, you're, half expecting to see people. I have never driven down a dark country road and been expecting to see a plucked chicken running around.
No, it's the combination of, to see a chicken running around, yes.
Maybe, yep.
To see a plucked chicken, okay,
No.
maybe. Well, no, okay, maybe somebody dropped a chicken.
Well, yeah.
To see a plucked chicken running around?
No.
No, that's that step that's too far.
Wow.
You'd have thought, knowing the end of the story, that it'd be the ghost of Sir Francis Bacon that you'd see.
Yes, really.
But no, apparently it is the plucked chicken that flaps around in a circle and then disappears.
Wow. Okay. I'm glad we're not having Christmas turkey this year.
No, too blooming expensive.
Well, yeah, and that. Well, okay, so that was a corker. You've outdone me already. But do you know the answer to my question? Why did the ghost of Hale Fanog run up the family a massive bill?
I don't know, but if it's anything like us, it just turned the heating on.
Quite well. I mean, you're not a million miles away. Basically,
Did it flash all the lights and leave them on so they ran up a lecky bill?
that it was an electric bill. Yeah. Literally, it ran up a massive electricity bill. Well, many massive electricity bills. The epicenter of all the weird activity seemed to be around where the electricity meter was situated in the house. And in fact, the family would often hear the noise of it frantically whirring when the paranormal activity was kicking off.
Oh, wow.
They experienced all sorts of things in that house, from disgusting phantom smells to full-bodied apparitions, runs of bad luck and ill health, amongst many other things. But one of the most perplexing things about the case, and the reason, I've heard of it prior to this podcast, was the unexplained electricity usage. The family would receive electricity bills of £750 for 3 months' usage in the 1980s.
Cool, that's cheap nowadays.
Well, it is nowadays, but in today's money, that would equate to £2,000 a month, which is insane. Even in this current energy crisis, it's outrageous, let alone back in the 1980s when the family were living in the farmhouse. The electricity board investigated on multiple occasions, but nothing could ever be found to explain what on earth was going on. They did all sorts of tests, couldn't find anything. They went there expecting to find a tap, that somebody was stealing their electricity, basically. Nothing like that. And the weirdest thing of all, I feel, was that during lulls in the paranormal activity, although those were few and far in between, the couple did experience more normal electricity bills. So it's just what was going on there.
Yeah, and you do hear, and we've had it happen a few times when we've gone on a sort of paranormal investigation and your batteries get drained and
It's
things
classic,
like that.
yeah, battery drain.
But I don't think I've ever really heard of one just sucking it out of the mains before.
No, and I mean, it did make me think. I know we've talked about this on this show before. When we first got an EMF detector, so electromagnetic field meter, you bought me one that was designed for electricians, basically, because they're much more reliable, essentially. And of course, we just went around the house testing everything to see what gave off EMF. And actually, it turns out our house is the electrics are pretty well shielded. There was not a lot that set it off at all, not even over light switches, things like that, except our switchboard under the stairs. So the fuse board, under the stairs. Absolutely buried. Well, it doesn't have a needle, it's digital. But if it had a needle, it would have buried the needle. And the interesting thing about that is, it is literally, that's the location where we see all the activity.
Yeah. Both up and downstairs.
Up and downstairs. And in fact, I went to the top of the stairs with the EMF detector and sat on top of the stairs, so directly above the cupboard that the fuse board is in. And it had exactly the same effect. So it buried the needle. It's like a column of EMF going through the house. And that's where we see apparitions and we hear noises. And the cat talks to a ghost at the top of the stairs.
Yeah.
So we're back to chickens. We've got a chicken and an egg situation.
Well, I was just going to mention this, but the thing that occurs to me is, yes, we know that EMF fields can affect people.
Yes.
But you have to be in the field for it to affect you.
Absolutely.
It's not like you're stood outside of it looking in that it affects you. It doesn't work like that.
It doesn't, it's not like it distorts reality inside of it.
When we see stuff, we are outside of where the field is.
Exactly. And we know that because we've measured it.
Yeah.
We've literally measured it. So you have to get right up close to this cupboard for it to have any effect on the meter. You have to stick the meter next to the fuse board.
Yeah.
Anywhere within, from 2 foot away from it, nothing. Apart from if you go straight up.
Yeah, so weird one.
Mm.
So do I get a point for that?
Yeah, go on then.
Yeah.
You had half a point.
Half?
Well, you said gas first. You said
I did say electric next. Obviously,
you said electric next.
2.
So you got it after I gave you a clue. So you can have half a point.
Okay, half a point. I gave you the opportunity of earning loads of bonus points.
I'm going to give you the opportunity to earn loads of points with the next question. Okay, so fear not. In fact, we'll do that right now. Okay. So my next question before we get into the second story. One of the paranormal TV shows that we've enjoyed this year was Haunted Homecoming, in which Jack Osborne teams up with Dr. Kate Sherrill to investigate some of the locations around the place that Jack grew up in Buckinghamshire. My question to you, and I know you've watched this series because we watched it together, is can you name any of the places that they investigated? And you can have a point for each one you get right.
Right, okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm being easy with you on this next one. I was being quite kind, so we shall see. Okay, well, many countries around the world have stories of lake monsters. Possibly the most famous of which is Nessie. But Nessie's fame has somewhat eclipsed the UK's other lake monsters. Can you tell me the name and or location of another of the UK's lake monsters?
You think that was an easy question?
Yeah.
No, I can't. Okay, well, I'll try and dredge some up from the depths of my memory, but I think I'm losing the point on that one. Shall we have another story?
Okay, let's.
This one is from Bob.
My parents were pretty cool compared to their peers, and into all sorts of stuff, so our childhood years were somewhat unconventional. As an example, we would have sessions with psi cards, the triangle, circle, wavy lines, etc., with us kids being tested for abilities, just for fun, I think. My dad was always researching something or other obscure or esoteric, lost continents, spiritualism, ghosts, UFOs. Like I said, I didn't have a conventional childhood. Whether that was because of my earlier experiences is a matter of debate. It certainly led my sister to be a lifelong Wiccan. Me, I'm spiritual but not religious. Anyway, enough for the potted family history. My dad tinkered at making things in his spare time, and at one point made a couple of pentacle pendants for my sister and I. He'd made them from leftover scrap metal, iron and copper for my sister, and a pure copper one for me. Real works of art. We wore them daily, as others would wear a crucifix or St. Christopher. As normal 11 to 12-year-olds do, my friends and I used to play in the local park all summer long, only returning home when it began to get dark. It was a typical English public park, with landscapes, paths and tennis courts, an old bandstand and clumps of wooded area, all surrounded by a wrought iron boundary fence with stout gates at the various exits that the park keepers would lock at dusk. Although us kids knew all of the places where a bent railing or two would allow us in or out. It serviced the needs of all the surrounding neighbourhoods, and we kids used to usually keep to the part of the park nearest our home exit, so we didn't mix with groups other than those kids we grew up with. One of our favourite spots was the tarmac surface playground, swings, a seesaw and spiderweb-shaped roundabout, which all nestled into a sort of natural amphitheatre lined with mature trees and grass. It was available to all, but we seemed to be the only ones who used it in the evenings approaching twilight. Anyway, we'd all been playing games in amongst the trees and sliding down the huge dirt slides on the slopes, as kids did in the old days before we had techie toys and phones, when I noticed that somewhere along the way I'd broken the chain of my pentacle pendant, and it was dangling down inside my shirt, minus the pentacle. Now, I was somewhat upset, not because of the fear of no longer having its protection, but because it was a one-of-a-kind gift from my dad. How could I tell him that I'd been so careless as to lose it? Days went by. A kid's life seems to drag. School, home, eat, out to play with friends for a couple of hours, rinse and repeat. We found ourselves back in the playground area, sitting on the swings, talking about whatever kids talked about back then, when a boy a bit younger than us, who none of us knew, so we assumed he must be from the other side of the park, came wandering out of the trees and grass at the edge of the slope, and came up to me, held his hand out and said, "Does this belong to you?" Handing me, you guessed it, my pentacle. Then he just walked away. I was just too dumbfounded to react, other than to mumble a thank you. I wasn't freaked out or scared, just like, how the heck? How did he even find it in all of that grass and trees in the first place? And how did he know to bring it to me, days after I'd originally been there to lose it in the first place? Who was he? In the years that followed, until we all grew up and stopped playing in the park, we never saw that kid again. I've never been able to rationalise the experience.
And thank you so much to Bob for sharing that story with us. That is so strange, though. How on earth could that kid have possibly known that it was his? And I have to say as well that I've had a similar experience in that I've lost like the thing of a necklace, the pendant of a necklace in the garden when I was just doing some gardening. Chain broke, the actual pendant is gone. Now, we have not got a big garden. It is a small garden. It is a postage stamp. And I still haven't found it. And it's in my garden. So the chances of it being found even in such a big park by somebody that you never saw before or since, doesn't know you at all. How? Just how?
Yeah, it really piqued my interest. And the reason that I chose it is mostly because, obviously, we spoke to Icy Sedgwick last episode.
Yeah.
And this has kind of a fae feeling to me.
Yeah, fae, trickstery kind of, impy kind of, brownie, helpful, spirity.
Yeah, on face value, he loses a necklace, somebody brings it back. No biggie.
Mm-hmm.
But just the surrounding influences, like you say, it was days later, it was got to be really difficult to find. But also you'll notice that his pentacle was only copper.
Not copper and iron.
Not copper and iron.
Oh, wow. I didn't even pick up on that till you said.
Did you not?
Yeah, but you're completely right.
I was just like, I wonder if it had been the other way around and he'd had the iron and copper one, whether it wouldn't have been returned.
That's really interesting.
But then you wouldn't have a story. It'd just be, I lost my necklace as a kid, and you'd never know.
But you see, I think that it's these kind of stories that we might be in danger of losing. Because again, like in years gone by, this story, I think a lot more people would have made that kind of fake connection. Because it was just more commonly in sort of the public consciousness, if you like.
Yeah.
And because it isn't so much now, I think that stories like this might have fallen by the wayside because they haven't got the same meaning attached to them. And like that's one of the things that I'm really enjoying about kind of diving into folklore a bit and almost rediscovering it, is just the extra level that these kind of stories are given.
It is a weird one because I don't really go in for fairies. It's not really my bag. But it's kind of, as we've been finding with some other things, it's almost like it's generated by people's belief in them. So as long as somebody does.
I'm not sure I agree with you there because no, not generally, fairy stories haven't been my bag historically. I think what I'm taking away from the whole looking more at folklore thing is that it's just basically the same conclusion we have always ended up coming to since we started the show, is that we don't know what any of this stuff is. Like, we literally don't know.
No.
We have no idea. We love to categorise stuff and put it in pigeonholes, but at the end of the day, we don't know if it's all the same thing.
Indeed, we don't. And another thing that I don't know is the answer to your question.
Well, I think I need to answer your question first, don't I? To which I also do not know the answer. I didn't know there were any other lake monsters in the UK. You're going to have to enlighten me.
Okay, so there's a few to choose from. You've got Morag of Loch Morar.
Right.
Obviously still in Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
Deepest body of fresh water in the British Isles, potentially making the perfect home for a legendary lake monster.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a number of reports of this unexplained creature in the loch, which dates back as far as 1887.
Mm-hmm.
Monster obviously known as Morag. Descriptions vary wildly, from a beautiful, reclusive mermaid-like figure to a black heap or ball slowing deliberately rising in the water, whose presence foreshadowed deaths and drownings.
Well, those are two very different things.
They are indeed. Other notable sightings describe Morag as similar to Nessie in appearance, including a sighting in 1948, which had 9 witnesses, and an encounter in 1979 where 2 men claim that they accidentally hit her with a boat.
Oh, no.
Apparently she was more recently spotted and even photographed in 2013 after no sightings for over 2 decades.
Oh, okay, so she's still around.
Yep, still staying in Scotland. You've got and apologies to any Scottish listeners, the Muck Shielk of Loch Maree. And apparently this is the 4th biggest freshwater loch in Scotland, and also said to serve as the habitat for a mysterious water creature, which has been described as resembling a large eel. Most notable is that one man had a vendetta against it, namely a Mr. Banks, who lives on Loch Maree's shore and attempted to drain the nearby loch and poison it with quicklime in an attempt to kill the creature. However, we're unsure as to why he so hates Muck Shielk.
Oh dear. Well, I had no idea. I have learnt something new. And
there is more.
Oh, sorry. There's another one.
No, there's Teggy and Bala Lake in Wales. A mysterious group of lake monsters, which live in Bala Lake, Wales, said to resemble a large pike.
So
potentially,
it's quite likely to be a large pike.
It's a large pike, but it's said to be as long as 3 dogs swimming together and has humps that poke through the water.
Okay, but that could be a sturgeon, couldn't it?
I don't know if there are sturgeon in Wales.
No, possibly not. But I mean, I have seen some absolutely whacking great fish.
Mm-hmm.
And I can understand how seeing one of those under the water could be mistaken for something a bit, more prehistoric.
Pike can get pretty big, but there are still more in England.
Oh, we've got some in England?
Yes, we've got the Eeke of Bassenthwaite Lake, also possibly Lake Windermere, but potentially at Windermere you've got Bow Nessie or Winnie.
Oh.
Indeed, and I must admit, when I was reading the article about this, they were like, why Winnie? I don't understand why they would call it Winnie.
Windermere.
Like, Windermere? Like, they were like, oh, we got Bow Nessie because there's a nearby village called Bow Ness, and we get the Bow Nessie, but they didn't get the Winnie. No. So, apparently, at Bassenthwaite Lake, you have it's not as deep as the locks by any stretch of the imagination, only 70 foot deep at the maximum point. So, not necessarily where you might think you'd have a secretive monster, but apparently the rumours go back centuries. The specific type of creature known as the Eeke is said to dwell in Bassenthwaite, though, as I said, one was also reported at Lake Windermere in 1873. Rather than looking like a sea serpent, an Eeke is a huge human-shaped creature with a snake-like head and slimy skin.
Oh, that's a new one.
And the most recent sighting was in 1973, but they appeared to be of a more Nessie-like beast.
Okay, well, I have to say,
take your pick.
I have always wanted to go up to Loch Ness and look for Nessie, and I've always wanted to camp somewhere near, something like Loch Ness. Oh, I see it. I've never been. I really, really want to go, and I'd really love to do like an overnight camp and just sort of sit and look out at the lake and keep an eye out for Nessie. But if there's all these other lakes and lochs and places that we could go to potentially do that, then that's very exciting.
Loch Ness is awesome, and there are perhaps 20 or 30 Japanese tourists that have pictures of me freezing my bum off in Loch Ness.
A bit cold, is it?
As a child, yes. Well, when I was 18, a group of friends and I decided to take a road trip up to Scotland, and one of the things we had to do was visit Loch Ness.
Absolutely.
And we took a dinghy with us.
Oh, wow.
And it was freezing. It was so cold, but we were determined. So there were 4 of us in this little inflatable dinghy, and we'd rowed it perhaps 20 or 30 feet away from the shore, and we were just blue. We were so cold. And then this boat load of tourists comes chugging past, like on the Nessie tour. And obviously they're all
spotted you guys.
Spotted us. I don't know whether they thought we were Nessie because we were, the vaguely boat-shaped with appendages, blue appendages.
Blue appendages.
And they're like, oh. But yeah, I'm pretty sure they were Japanese. They had some pretty epic telephoto lenses on their cameras.
And this was years ago?
This was 98.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a little while ago now. But yeah so... There's a group of people in Japan
that may
somewhere
think that they've seen Loch Ness and it was actually you freezing.
Yeah, they may
dinghy.
think they'd saw Nessie and it was just me being cold.
Oh, bless you. Well, before I give you the answer to my question, as you say you don't know it, I have to admit that I've just realised I made a little boo-boo giving you the answer to the last question. Because when I said that the electricity bills at Hale Vanog were about £750 a month. No, sorry. I said that the electricity bills at Hale Vanog were about £750 for 3 months, and then proceeded to say, which equates to £2,000 of today's money every month, which it doesn't, of course. What I meant was £750 for every 3 months would equate to £2,000 of today's money every 3 months. My brain's fried. We haven't had much sleep. But anyway, back to my question.
Yeah, remind me of your question once again.
Okay. So my question was regarding the TV series Haunted Homecoming with Jack Osborne and Kate Sherrill. So we really enjoyed watching that. They investigated quite a few places around Buckinghamshire because that's where Jack Osborne grew up.
Yep.
Can you tell me the names of any of the places they investigated? And you can have a point for each one that you get.
I'm not going to remember the names. I remember they did his old house, and then they did his local pub. Yep. And a theatre.
Well, I'm going to give you a point for remembering, that much. Even if you couldn't remember the names. Because I remembered one of the names, but I had to look the name of the pub and the theatre up, to be fair. So, yeah, you can have a point. I mean, you're in the lead anyway with 1.5. I've got nothing. So they investigated, yes, the house he grew up is called Welder's House, which is a 19th century house. It's more like a mansion, to be honest. I mean, it's absolutely massive. It's got wings. Anything with wings isn't really a house anymore, is it?
No.
They also investigated the Swan Theatre at High Wycombe and the Royal Standard Pub, which is yet another pub to lay claim to the title of the oldest pub in England. There are a few of them.
There are.
And Missenden Abbey, which is the only one I could have remembered the actual name of.
Right. Well, yeah, I obviously remembered watching it.
Yep.
I'm not very good with names.
No, fair enough.
So, is this going to be the first year that I've actually won?
Well,
no,
we've still got
you're
2
going to put a pack at
questions
the
to
end, aren't you?
go. No, I doubt it. But we've still got two questions to go, one each.
Okay, so my final question to you. And I finished on a really easy one, so you're going to claw it back now. Which royal residence is said to be haunted over the Christmas period?
Sandringham. I'm sorry. Couldn't even wait for the answers for that one. That was very kind of you to give me a question that I could actually answer, so I wouldn't look like a complete total loser.
I thought I was being very sweet to give you a really easy one to
You
finish.
are. You were very sweet. Otherwise, I would have ended with 0.
And now you're going to give me a really hard one in return, aren't you?
It's fun. I mean, this is one of those questions that nobody's going to know the answer to. So for this, you really just need to use your imagination.
Okay.
And be creative. Okay.
I can do that.
So it's also a bit of a cheat because it's not actually paranormal. But it comes courtesy of one of the books that you bought to research the ghosts of Lincolnshire for the paranormal postcard trip that we're about to tell you about very shortly. Namely, Polly Howart's Ghosts and Legends of Lincolnshire and the Fen Country. We've got other books by Polly Howard, and one of the things she does in her books that I really love is that she includes in the back of the book a glossary of local dialect from the county that she's investigating. So, I have for you some of my favourite examples of local dialect from Lincolnshire and the Fen Country, and I would like you to tell me what they mean, and you can have a point for any that you get even close, to be honest. So, and you've got a while to think about it while we read the next story.
Yep.
You've got imbrangled, jiffling, flimiticate, it gets better, slummocky, you might get that one. I can't even say this one. Ansham hang on. Ansham scransham.
Okay.
Pheasantpenny. Oddling. And finally, Wadden organs.
Okay. Well, at least you give me plenty of options.
Yeah, exactly. You've got loads to choose from. Use what do they think about what they sound like.
Yeah, I shall phlegmaticate on it while we hear the next story. And this one is from Cody.
I was working at an animal shelter in Chicago. I loved this job. But my boyfriend and I split up and I needed to move out of the apartment we shared. I absolutely hated my home state of New York, but I really didn't love Chicago either. However, I had a job and the shelter manager offered to promote me to management if I stayed, which was tempting. I was basically facing a very hard decision of stay or go back home. My emotions were very intense while I was trying to figure out what to do, and I had about 2 months to figure it out. About this time, people started telling me that they were seeing me when I wasn't at the shelter. I didn't look like anyone else who worked there. I'm much shorter than most adults and was one of the only brunettes. I would get texts while sitting at home asking why I was at work and where I'd gone. Texts like, "Hey, just saw you. Isn't this your day off? Where did you go, lol? I can't find you anywhere." I'd reply that I was at home and never went to work. This happened more than once. When I was there, people would see me in several places simultaneously. One time I was in the backyard, headed inside. The doorway went into the main dog room, and another doorway went from this room into the rest of the building. Picture a huge circular room with 2 doors on opposite sides. I walk in and the other door opens. My colleague Jessica walks through and screams as if she's startled, saying things like, "What the hell? How? No, you..." And she went back through her doorway and into the kitchen. She looked gobsmacked. She then explained that she walked past the kitchen, saw me doing dishes on her left, opened the door 10 feet past that kitchen and saw actual me coming in from the backyard. The distance to that backyard doorway was about 100 feet from her doorway, and she saw both of us in one instant. She went back into the kitchen when she was stumbling over her words, and nobody was in there. Other people saw this thing too, always in my work uniform, always with my specific hairstyle, and never interacting with them, just walking along quietly, ignoring them, or doing dishes with my back turned. 2 other colleagues saw me walking around when they knew I was driving the work van around the city. They followed this thing into the kitchen, and it walked into this creepy water closet. They followed it in, all the while saying, "Hey, how did the adoptions go? How did you get back so early? What are you doing? Hello?" And then, when they entered that tiny closet just behind her, there was nobody in there. They couldn't believe it, and both experienced this at the same time. They called me, and I was, indeed, still driving around the city, nowhere near that shelter. They continued to see this thing even after I moved 800 miles away. All I can think is that it was maybe a form of me which produced from my emotions, or maybe a different version of me making a decision to stay in another timeline. But that shelter was haunted anyway. We all had mild experiences with a female ghost who would sing and go shh at us. One girl saw a man in plaid standing behind her in a mirror and turned around to an empty room. So the energy of the place was creepy anyway. Maybe that had something to do with it.
Wow, thank you for sharing those stories, Cody. And I must say, the first thing that springs to mind is like the kind of stone tape effect, where it's just a recording of a person going about their daily lives.
Mm-hmm.
Why can't that happen when somebody's alive?
Well, I think it can. I mean, we've heard stories before about people encountering ghosts of people that they know are alive.
Mm-hmm.
There's also... See, I was going down more the road of the crisis apparitions. So with crisis apparitions, people... I know usually with crisis apparitions, the ghosts are of people who do die, but often at the time they appear to a family member or loved ones, it's just before they die or at the moment of death or while they're, while they're getting themselves into a situation that causes their death. So they're not actually, passed on yet. And that is, I've always assumed, possibly to do with heightened emotion.
They tend to interact though. Like in this instance, like none of the time does she interact. Whereas with crisis apparitions, it's like, I got to tell you this, or they...
But she has mentioned that it was a time of heightened emotion. So I think that's why my brain was going there more. This idea of, that sort of turbulent energy being projected out.
It sounds like it was an active place as well, so it must be kind of prone to that sort of thing.
Yeah, maybe there's something else going on there a bit, but yeah, that's such an interesting story.
So thank you again to Cody for sharing that story with us, and it's time to go back to the Not Once VS Christmas quiz. I don't even need to ask my question again. Haunted royal residence at Christmas.
Sandringham.
Well done. You get a
Queen's
point.
residence.
Yeah,
I guess now the King's residence. The reason I knew this one was because we covered it in one of our previous Christmas episodes. So I couldn't very well not know it. I should have had minus points if I didn't know that one, to be perfectly honest.
I was concerned that, I hadn't given you anything particularly easy. I didn't think the others were too bad, but
they were very hard. The other ones were very hard.
Indeed. And in case anyone is interested, the activity that happens at Sandringham over the Christmas period tends to start on Christmas Eve and last for a few weeks afterwards. Lights will switch on and off. Heavy breathings heard in empty rooms. phantom footsteps, doors opening and closing on their own, and Christmas cards are moved from where they're placed. There's even a phantom breathing sack that was seen by a footman, but I'm not entirely sure what that means.
Well, I know, neither am I. I don't remember that bit. Okay. Well.
Okay.
Are you ready for some Lincolnshire/Fenland dialect?
I'm going to do my best.
Okay. So, shall we go through the list?
Yep, go through the list.
Have a stab.
I'll have a stab at them.
Yeah, just like I say, use your creative mind.
Yep.
Imbrangled.
That's
what does it sound like?
It's got the sort of embroiled, like tangled up in something kind of vibe to me.
Kind of, yeah, mixed up / confused. But I'm going to give you that one.
Okay.
Because, mixed up is, you were kind of going there. So, yeah, good call, 1 point. You're on 2.5 now.
Yep.
Jiffling.
I was jiffling along, just, minding my own business.
Do you know what? I love this. I think whatever you come up with is going to be as much more of a delight than the actual meanings. I quite like that.
Just or just a small measure, like, I'll have a jiffling.
That's really good. Okay, it means to fidget, apparently.
Oh, right.
But okay. I kind of prefer your meanings.
I'm all a jiffling.
All right. Now, this is a good one. Flimiticate. I'm not sure if that's how you're supposed to pronounce it. That's what it looks like.
That, to me, is very pontificate. It's like, I'm going to have to flimiticate over that one.
It means affect genteel manners. So, yeah, you don't get that one. But again, I love the one that you came up with. You might get this one just because it sounds a bit like what it means. Slummocky.
There he was, slummocked in the corner. Look at him.
A little bit. It means untidy.
Yeah.
You were kind of getting there, but not quite. So, now, this is the one I can't say. Ansham Scransham.
See, that, to me, has got a bit of an argy-bargy vibe to it. Like, there's a bit of an Ansham Scransham at the pub last night.
I can totally see that. It sort of... Well, yeah, kind of. I might give you half a point for that because it says topsy-turvy or disorderly. So you're kind of going, I think you can get half a point. I mean, I've lost anyway, so who cares at this point? Okay. Pheasant penny.
Pheasant penny. And that just sounds like, a sort of 17th century Bond secretary.
Pheasant penny, it does.
Good morning, Pheasant Penny.
Morning, Pheasant Penny. How's the stocks? All right, mister. No, it means money spent on a bargain.
All right. Okay.
Which is, I love that because we don't have a word for that. It's one of those things that there used to be a word for that one tiny specific thing, and now we don't have them. And I want to bring that back into use.
Okay.
This is a nice one. Oddling. It's very sweet. Oddling.
Oddling.
I'm an oddling.
Oh, I've got to be very careful about what I say now. I've got to be very careful. A delightful young lady.
No, don't be careful. Just go with your gut.
See, it kind of feels to me like a small animal. It's an oddling. It's like the baby otter or something. It's got that kind of vibe.
It has kind of got that cutesy vibe. Yeah, it just means one different from the rest.
Oh, right. Yeah, okay. I see
I'm
that.
Literally an oddling. It's it's a lovely, cute word.
Okay, yeah.
I love it.
I'm good with it.
Okay, the last and my favourite.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's so random. Wadden organs.
Or wadden organs.
Because you normally, right, when you have these words, they often sum something up. So you might have, like affect genteel manners. There's 3 words, and there's just one word for it. Flimiticate's great. You're saving letters. This one, no. So that's your clue. Like, there's no need for this. There's no need for this to be this long.
Tell me what it is again.
Wadden organs.
Wadden organs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it feels to me like a plant or something like that that's got a weird shape. or sort of a collection,
Some
like
kind of
reeds
floral
or
fauna, maybe.
glass or grass or something like that. Just
Not really.
no.
No, afraid not. I can see where you're going with that, though.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, no, it's frogs.
Okay.
See? This is why I was just like, why on earth would you take a nice, simple, succinct word like frogs and turning it into something as complicated as wadden organs? I'm presuming the organ is,
and the
is
organ's
from where
got to be the sort
noise,
of the noise.
because they're noisy,
It's
aren't
the
they?
wadden. Where's the wadden come
I
from?
don't know, but I love
You'd
it.
have thought hopping organs.
Yeah, can end what? It might be though that wadden is another Lincolnshire Fenland dialect word.
Yeah.
And we just, maybe don't know what that is.
Yep, true.
Maybe that's fallen out of use, and even Polly Howard doesn't know it.
Indeed. Now I've got that frog song in my head now.
Bo,
Oh.
yep.
Yeah. It's a bit of a Christmassy one, isn't it?
It is. Well, that brings us.
I won the quiz.
You did.
Is that the first time I've won? I think it is the first time I've won the quiz, isn't it?
To be honest, every time we do the quiz, by the time we've finished it, usually both of us have lost track of who's got what points.
You normally give me really, really hard ones, and I try and give you some easy ones, and I've actually come out on top this year.
Well,
so
I thought I gave you some quite kind ones because I thought you knew about the Hell Van case, and I'm sure we've looked at that before. And I knew you'd watched the Haunted Homecoming series, so
Yep.
I tried.
Yep.
I tried.
Okay, and I do appreciate the half points, which help me actually add up to a win.
To a win.
Yes.
Fitz is the winner.
What do I win?
What do you win? You win a Christmas cracker with a dodgy joke.
Oh, okay. That's fine. I'm down with
You
the
happy-
Christmas
happy
cracker
with
and the
that?
dodgy joke. Yeah, it's not
Awesome.
Christmas until that happens anyway.
No, precisely. But before we get to Christmas cracker and dodgy joke time, my goodness, do we have a paranormal postcard for you? If I were you, dear listeners, I would go and get yourself a cup of tea, a few biscuits, maybe a mince pie, blanket, maybe even a hot water bottle if it's cold where you are, and settle in for a rather epic Christmas paranormal postcard as we tell you all about our trip to Lincoln Castle in our Christmas comedy of errors.
As I'm sure we've mentioned many times, as well as producing this podcast, we both have day jobs. Lil works full-time, and I run my own podcast production company. Due to global conditions, there's been a drop in the demand for my professional services, and Lil has had to partake in ever-increasing amounts of overtime. And this has led to a somewhat unfair division of labour between us, as Lil does most of the research and writing for the episodes, whilst I do all the techie bits like recording, editing, producing, and maintaining the website. Entirely incidentally, if anyone has a podcast and needs editing or post-production services, then do hit me up. Anyway, this being the case, it made sense that I took on more of the episode planning and writing, and I had the great idea of doing everything myself for our Christmas episode. I was oh so proud of taking the workload off Lil's plate and set about in earnest to come up with somewhere to visit with an intriguing history and perhaps more importantly, some great ghost stories. These aren't the only criteria that we have to follow though. Some of you might be aware that we have a diabetic kitty who needs feeding at specific times and insulin injections twice daily. This limits how far we can travel in a day, in that we have to be out and back before feeding time. It's not really like you can ask someone else to drop in and do it either. So, with all this in mind, I went looking for somewhere reasonably close by that we hadn't visited before, and I was suddenly struck with inspiration. We recently took a lightning quick visit to Yorkshire, which is a little outside of our normal day trip range, but we were only going to pick up some acoustic panels for the coffee studio that was at the time still under construction. Anyway, none of that's really important, other than to say that as we drove up to Yorkshire, we passed the turn-off signs for Lincoln Castle and Cathedral quite early on in our journey up the Great North Road. I pondered. A castle and a cathedral. Between them they had to have at least a couple of ghost stories. So, were there any ghosts? Of course there were. How could there not be, with Lincoln Castle being built on top of the site of a Roman legionary fortress and partially from the very same stone? It was the site of a few battles, contained a Victorian prison, and housed one of only 4 surviving copies of the 1215 Magna Carta. Add to that a number of ghosts that stalked the streets around the castle, and that Lincoln Cathedral, which itself was home to some pretty interesting history and legends, was only a stone's throw away. I was pretty sure I'd hit the jackpot. The more I researched, the more confident I became. We could definitely make it there and back in time to give little Fitz her insulin injection. There were several car parks dotted around the castle, which is very handy for those of us who have to lug around notebooks, guidebooks, audio recorders and cameras, amongst other things, as it was just a quick 5-minute walk back to the car if we needed something we didn't fancy carrying just for the sake of it. It's also nice to be able to nip back to the coffeemobile for a quick coffee and a break, to discuss our thoughts, gobble down a sandwich, check our notes and guidebooks, and make sure we'd cover everywhere we needed to. Our tickets would also include a walk of the entire castle medieval curtain wall, and these looked to be in a somewhat more sturdy condition than the slightly less well-protected Framlingham Castle that we'd recently visited, where circumnavigating the exposed ramparts had elevated our heart rate somewhat. Even better, it was nearly Christmas, and the castle were holding illuminated wall walks after sunset. This was an experience we couldn't miss, surely. I was a little bit concerned that they were also holding a Christmas market in Lincoln at the same time, as this would likely mean that it would be a bit busier than we would otherwise expect. But we were going on a ticketed tour anyway, and besides, how busy could it be? Especially, I noted, if Lil booked a day off work and we went during the week instead of at a weekend. I distinctly remember saying that I was sure it wouldn't be that busy, and so I gave it little more thought other than it might provide a few festive photo opportunities. Well, those of you that have heard of or have ever been to Lincoln Christmas Market will already be sniggering. You see, Christmas markets originate in medieval Germany. In fact, the Dresden Christmas market was first held in 1434. Over the years, they've developed and changed, and there's more than a little controversy involved in their history, but they're so entrenched now in German history that some scholars are recommending that German Christmas markets receive UNESCO World Heritage recognition. They are a big deal. Thousands of tour buses descend on each city's market, with the Cologne Christmas market alone attracting 4 million visitors a year, as trees and buildings are festooned with twinkling lights. Hundreds of stalls are set up, selling traditional Glühwein, Bratwurst, Lebkuchen, Eierpunsch, Stollen, and other seasonal gifts, as well as nativity scenes, singing and dancing, and other attractions. There are even Christmas market river cruise tours that visit Christmas market towns along the Danube from Germany to Hungary. My personal experiences of Christmas markets are somewhat less impressive. I'm not really a big fan of crowds, so I tend to do most of my Christmas shopping online now, but even when I did venture into town over Christmas, I would dash in and out to avoid the worst of the Christmas rush. A time or two, I'd seen German Christmas markets advertised, but this tended to be little more than a normal market, just with more fairy lights and with the addition of a bratwurst stall and a mulled wine stall. In other words, not a lot to write home about. Lincoln, however, was the first city in the UK to host a German-style Christmas market, after town officials visited their twin city in Germany, Neustadt, in 1982, and were so impressed by what they experienced that they decided to hold their own in Lincoln beginning that very year. It started off small with just 11 stalls, but has continued to grow over the years and is now itself one of Europe's largest Christmas markets, inspiring similar events across the country, though obviously the ones I've accidentally attended were somewhat less impressive. We were at this point, though, blissfully unaware of just what we were walking into, and I booked tickets for both of us for the castle tour and the illuminated wall walk. We both began to research the ghosts of Lincoln Castle and the surrounding area, making plans for where to visit, downloading town maps and making notes of everything we needed to see. I'd even made a spreadsheet, get me. I'd noted that the castle would be opening a little later than usual due to the Christmas market, and that the castle grounds would contain a few of the market stalls, but there was nothing else on the castle, cathedral or council parking websites to suggest that there was anything else to be concerned about. I'd made sure to book the tour to give us plenty of leeway if we left late, because we always leave late, and for traffic, because if you don't account for traffic, you know you'll hit a jam. But this day, it all seemed to be going our way. Now, we're not morning people, not by any stretch of the imagination, and getting up early for a road trip typically results in a lot of flapping, frantic running around like under-caffeinated headless chickens, and no small amount of profanities. So, a long journey with timed tickets at the end of it was a potential recipe for disaster. But there was a bit of winter magic in the air that morning. We woke to a world shrouded in mist, dulling the already weak winter morning light to almost darkness. But despite this, we actually rose on time for once, managed to pack our gear and ourselves in the van with minimal fuss, and we were on our way with an on-the-go breakfast steaming in our chilly hands before we knew it. We'd done the seemingly impossible. We were actually leaving on time for once, a minor Christmas miracle in itself. The foggy landscape set the perfect backdrop for a spooky day out as we drove up the A1, a road that largely follows the route of the Great North Road, a coaching route running from London to Edinburgh that's been in use for centuries. As the miles slip by, we noticed many empty and abandoned roadside inns along our route. Some older, some newer, but so many crumbling, dilapidated and forgotten. I couldn't help but wonder how many of these stood on the site of the numerous coaching inns that would have once lined this route, and I kept one eye on the mist-shrouded fenland that stretched out either side of us, hoping to catch a glimpse of a spectral highwayman galloping through the fog. Sadly, we failed to spot any spectral highwayman, and my mind began to wander, thinking of all the things that we hoped to see in Lincoln, chief amongst them, of course, the Magna Carta, that most famous historic document that we find so often weaves its way in and out of the history and stories we research for the show. I wondered absent-mindedly if we were taking a similar route to the Magna Carta itself when it was transported from London to Lincoln, following the meeting in Runnymede of King John and the rebel barons in 1215. This turbulent period in British history just keeps cropping up in our research of late. In fact, we only just visited it again during our recent trip to Framlingham Castle, in which we met some of the rebel barons that forced John's hand to signing that first copy of the Magna Carta in Runnymede. As we've touched upon in other episodes, King John was not a well-loved king, and the fact that over the centuries he's come to represent an almost caricature villain in historical fiction and legend, perhaps none so famously as in the tale of Robin Hood, tells us a lot of what we need to know about how he was regarded as the country's ruler. Today, historians might note that he was a hard-working man and an able general, but he was also well known to be petty, spiteful and cruel. During his reign, he would see the loss of his territories in France, and his attempts to regain them would cost him dearly in both men and the support of his noblemen, as they were pressed heavily to fund his campaign. He would frequently find new ways to tax or otherwise squeeze money from them, often beyond what they could actually afford, and then to punish them when they did not or could not comply. It seems that there were 101 reasons to dislike King John, but it was mostly a financial one that pushed several of his barons into open rebellion. King John had not long returned from his most recent failed campaign to restore his French territories in 1214, when the discontented barons met with John in London to demand redress of their grievances. John requested time to consider their demands, but immediately set about raising an army and pledging to the Pope to carry out a crusade in order to gain special papal protection. The barons assembled in our county town of Northampton in late April of 1215 to hear John's response, but he failed to attend himself, and so the barons provided his representatives with their list of demands. When John was delivered them, he flew into a rage and sent his messengers to assure the barons that he would never grant them their demands. So, in May of 1215, the barons renounced their feudal obligations to John, and, as they also just happened to have brought their armies with them, they set about causing a ruckus, and took the cities of Exeter and Lincoln, as well as, perhaps more importantly, London. This somewhat forced John to the negotiating table, and so John and the rebels met at Runnymede near Windsor Castle on the 10th of June, where the barons' demands, after some days of negotiation, were put onto paper as a peace agreement on the 15th, and this document would later come to be known as the Magna Carta. For all the importance this document was to later have in history, it is a somewhat simple affair. Written as a single, if rather long paragraph, it contains 63 clauses mostly dealing with taxes, trade, the regulation of the feudal society, and the operation of the justice system. But it also placed limits on the king's power, and by establishing the law as a power that both the king and the people must follow. It wasn't actually meant to be a grand charter of rights for all, merely to protect the barons by placing limits on the king's power, but it set the precedent that everyone, including the king, was subject to the law, and it took the first steps in establishing a parliamentary democracy in England. In fact, 4 clauses from this 1215 document are still valid today, and there are clear influences in both the American Bill of Rights of 1791 and the Universal Bill of Human Rights of 1948. It was very widely published at the time, but only 4 copies remain today, one of which is the property of Lincoln Cathedral, and has been since 1215, and which is on permanent loan to Lincoln Castle, where it's on display in a special vault. Sadly, neither John nor the barons were to make any great efforts to abide by the terms of the treaty, as we shall soon see, but as such an important document, and one that I'd heard so much about in school as a boy, it was something that I was quite keen to witness with my own eyes. Traffic was light, and with plenty of time in hand, we got to Lincoln. Even the traffic in Lincoln itself was light, and it felt like everything was running smoothly. Too smoothly. I brushed off the first signs of something unusual as I was too busy concentrating on where we were headed, but I did at least subliminally register that there was an awful lot of traffic cones around, with no sign of building works going on. In fact, it didn't take too long to notice that almost all of the on-street parking was coned off. Weird. Then we began seeing lots of temporary signs for park and ride, which, in case you aren't familiar with them, are where you park in a large car park, usually just outside of town, and then get bussed into the town centre. Lots of large towns and cities have them, but they're typically a permanent fixture, so the signs are mostly out of town on the roads and motorways leading into them, and the signage is normally permanent. These were temporary signs, hastily placed. Not to worry though, we'd left plenty of time and there were plenty of car parks around the castle. Even if we needed to keep driving loops around the castle until a space opened up, it wasn't a huge problem. As I mentioned earlier, I was so proud to have found such a good location with such interesting stuff going on in time for our visit. And as we all know, pride comes before a fall. And that falling feeling began in earnest when we began to see signs for road closures ahead. We went around the first by taking a side street and then continuing to head in the right general direction, the voice of Google Maps nagging in our ears to turn right, as we passed each closed street. The sense of falling escalated to a whistling in my ears and a flapping of loose hair as I gained momentum. Then, success. Signs to the car parks around the castle and more for the Christmas market. We were nearly there. Okay, so turn left here and... why are there people to the side of the road holding barriers? No time to worry about that. Light's green, let's go... Oh no. At the end of the street, just before the turning for the car park, was a police officer, stood in the middle of the road. He raised his hand for us to stop and approach the window. I'm afraid the road's closed, you'll have to turn around. We could have almost touched the castle walls from here, but instead, rather dejectedly, I turned the coffee-mobile around and started heading away from our destination. Back to the junction we'd just passed, with the people holding barriers, who were now placing said barriers in the road and glaring at us as they waited for us to pass so that they could complete their job. The sat-nav was being more hindrance than help with its constant unhelpful commands to turn around, so Lil turned it off and began scouring the map for alternative car parks, doing her best to point me in the general direction of something that might not be closed. As we meandered around uncertainly, the light or even almost non-existent traffic got heavier and heavier, and as we searched for somewhere to stop, even if it was just to get our bearings, we were driving further and further down the steep hill upon which the cathedral and castle reside. And as we got further and further away, the thought of having to climb that hill for longer and longer with all of our gear became more and more demoralizing. Also, what I previously considered as plenty of time to get to our castle tour booking was ebbing faster and faster away. The sense of falling became much more pronounced, and the world felt like it was rushing up towards me at an incredible pace. Dear listeners, you very nearly didn't get this episode, or at least an episode featuring Lincoln Castle, as at this point, stuck in traffic and with our ever-decreasing time slipping away, I was about ready to call the castle and see if it was possible to get a refund on our tickets and head home. Refund or not, it was beginning to look unlikely that we'd be able to make the tour, and I was getting a little bit grumpy. We were both eagle-eyed, searching for a car park. Anything would do. And then, from out of nowhere, we found one. It just popped up in front of us. I nosed the coffee-mobile in, only to find that not only was it full, but obviously everyone else had had the same idea. There was only one way in and out and very little room to turn around, and we wasted precious minutes waiting for the cars ahead to turn around and to do so ourselves before leaving again. And then, to make things even more difficult, we were now in a one-way system. We could only turn left, and this took us even further away from our destination. I really was about ready to give up and go home, but Lil was on hand to steady the ship, calmly encouraging me to just try a little further on and doing her best to convince me we could find somewhere within walking distance, even though I wasn't convinced, as I knew full well Lil considers walking distance anything under 10 miles. But we didn't have much choice anyway. The one-way system combined with the road closures left us only one way to go. Unfortunately, it seemed to be taking us back up the hill that had been so demoralizing earlier. Up and up we went, circling around the hilltop upon which both castle and cathedral stood, the cathedral towers looming over us. I could imagine the gargoyles chattering amongst themselves, taking bets on whether we'd stick it out or potter off in defeat. And then, as if from nowhere, we turned a corner and found our salvation. A full-on Christmas flippin' miracle. Choirs of heavenly angels might have been singing and playing trumpets, but we were too busy whooping our delight to have noticed, for just ahead of us was a big sign saying Christmas Market Parking, and just to the left of that, a few people in yellow jackets directing people into what was obviously normally some kind of community sports field. Joining the short queue of cars, we had one final panic as we realised that neither of us had enough cash on us for the £10 fee, but fortunately, even though we were visiting relics from the 13th century, we were still firmly in the 21st, as they were more than happy to accept payment by card. In fact, all the attendants were more than happy in general. Either the Christmas cheer was laid on particularly thick, or they were getting a nice little Christmas bonus for managing the impromptu car park. But whatever it was, they were wonderfully friendly, and as we were directed into our parking spot by a luminous baton-waving attendant like a 747 at Gatwick, we breathed a sigh of relief. As the clackety diesel engine of the coffee-mobile stilled, we congratulated ourselves on our good fortune, and a renewed enthusiasm for our adventure coursed through our veins.
As we hoisted heavily laden rucksacks on our backs and made our way out of the car park, one of the attendants asked if we knew where we were going. We must have looked as clueless and flustered as we felt. They kindly pointed us in the right direction, but we needn't have worried about losing our way. All we needed to do was follow the throngs of people flocking to the Christmas market, many amongst them bedecked with tinsel and Santa hats, their shopping bags swinging, a spring in their step and a gleeful party atmosphere in the air. Although we had a timed tour slot booked at the castle, there were actually quite a few other places in Lincoln that we wanted to check out. We'd lost time in our desperate hunt for a car park, but what we did still have on our side was that many of the spooky spots were clustered close together, all within the vicinity of the castle. Atop that steep hill that Fitz had been so worried about sits a cluster of heritage sites and buildings just oozing with ghost stories. And no wonder, given that the area is famously still dotted with bits of architecture dating back as far as the Romans. The high vantage point of the natural hill overlooking the River Witham, with its natural lake of Brayford Pool at its base, was not lost on the Romans when they arrived in Lincoln around the year AD 50. Of course, as is usually the case, the Romans weren't the first to make use of the advantageous features of the landscape in this area. The name Lincoln is thought to originate from the Celtic linden or lindo, meaning pool, and evidence of pre-Roman settlement has been found in the area around the lake on the River Witham. The Romans saw an opportunity here for an inland port, with the high natural hill providing a formidable defensive position for a legionary fortress. Add into this the bonus that the two major Roman roads of the Fosse Way and Ermine Street met here, providing links to London and Exeter, and the small Celtic settlement of Lindon soon became the important Roman town of Lindum. Some of these Roman town walls can still be seen standing in Lincoln today, and they have certainly stood the test of time, with the 3rd century Newport Archway being the only Roman gateway in the country to still have traffic passing through it. Although whether this is a good thing or not may be up for debate, as the ancient structure has twice been damaged by lorries getting wedged in the low archway, once in 1964 and again in 2017, which isn't surprising really, because I'm pretty sure the Romans weren't planning to accommodate lorries when they built it over 1800 years ago. The legionary fortress was in operation at Lincoln for 35 years, after which it became a colonia, essentially meaning that the fortress was retired and the town became a home for equally retired Roman soldiers who were given a bit of land and a pension to live out their days within the walls of Lindum Colonia, which, by the 2nd century, boasted public baths, temples, shops, a forum, and basilica amongst other buildings. Many of the remaining sections of Roman wall can be found in an area now known as the Cathedral Quarter, and in fact, on a plan of the Roman enclosure from an archaeological publication, we can see that these walls once passed right through the footprint of our first port of call, Lincoln Cathedral. Now, Lincoln Cathedral has a few claims to fame. In the present day, it's famous for having been used as a set for the 2006 blockbuster movie The Da Vinci Code. Historically, it was the tallest building in the world. Yep, not just England, but the whole world. A title which it held for 238 years from the completion of the spired central tower in 1311. But the renown that would be recognised both in the present day and by residents of the past has to be the legend of the Lincoln Imp. Tucked high up in the cathedral's angel choir, perched above an ornately carved pillar, sits an odd little stone figure. A furry, impish creature is depicted grinning wickedly down at the congregation through bared teeth. Horns curl crookedly from behind protruding ears, and the creature's 3-fingered claws rest lightly across one jauntily crossed leg, as though in laughing repose. There are many and varied stories about how this imp came to reside within the cathedral, but most agree that the grinning beast was sent by the devil himself. In some versions, the devil took offence at the very idea of the cathedral being built by Bishop Regimus, a monk appointed by William the Conqueror to establish a diocese in Lincoln in the year 1072. In his fury, the devil sent a horde of imps to attack the construction work, but the bishop's prayers whipped up a tremendous wind that blew the wicked creatures back from whence they came, all except one, who took shelter from the wind inside the cathedral. But the place was too holy for his impish origins, and he immediately turned to stone where he had landed. In another version, the devil sent 2 imps to England to cause mischief and generally create a hullabaloo. On their way to Lincoln, they stopped off at Chesterfield, Derbyshire, and sat on the spire of St Mary and All Saints Church, creating the famously twisting crooked spire that can still be seen today. Then, when they got to Lincoln, they tore around the cathedral wreaking havoc, tripping up the bishop, overturning furniture and breaking stained glass windows. Before it could do anything worse, an angel appeared to put an end to the imp's destruction and gave it a jolly good telling off. But the creature simply cackled and started to throw rocks by way of a reply. Well, the angel wasn't putting up with that and promptly turned the imp to stone, forevermore to grin down from his eternal perch up in the angel choir. Some say that the wicked imp frozen into the masonry of the cathedral is responsible for some of the building's misfortunes over the years, and it has had its fair share of calamities over the centuries. The first, Norman building, was ravaged by a great fire only 33 years after it was consecrated in 1091. In 1184, it was partially destroyed by an earthquake. In 1237, according to Daniel Codd's book Mysterious Lincolnshire, the cathedral's relatively new bishop was in the middle of delivering a fiery speech regarding the corruption he'd witnessed since taking the seat, and the story goes that no sooner had he boomed out the fateful words, "Were I to stay silent on these matters, surely the very stones themselves would fall," then the stones did that very thing, and the central tower promptly collapsed. I don't know how much of the bishop's speech is true, but the tower collapse certainly is. But they rebuilt it. Better, stronger, taller, the tallest in the world, in fact, until 1547, when a tremendous storm blew it down, taking part of the northeast transept roof along with it. It's not difficult to see how the naughty imp might have caught the blame for this series of unfortunate events. And still other versions of the legend say that the whole tale was cooked up by a canny Victorian jeweller who saw an opportunity to boost tourism and souvenir sales. But whatever the truth of the tale, the legend of the Lincoln Imp is alive and well today and has been wholeheartedly adopted by the city. The imp is known internationally as the emblem of Lincoln. The city's football team is nicknamed the Imps, and the imp souvenir business flourishes. And I love it. I often feel like the UK misses out on a lot of the fun tourist culture that promotes local legends in other countries, especially in places like the States where you can find towns proudly boasting their local myths, legends and cryptids by emblazoning them across mugs, t-shirts and bumper stickers. I know that some people probably find this a bit cheesy, but firstly, I love a bit of cheese. And maybe more importantly, I actually think it's just a really fun way of bringing local lore back into the spotlight and preserving the tales for generations to come. As a case in point, a BBC article on the Lincoln Imp I found online had hundreds of comments from the public under it, sharing stories about their visits, experiences and memories of the imp legend, and not just from locals. Some of them were from people in far-flung countries whose family members had brought back souvenirs of the Lincoln Imp from visits to the UK decades ago, often as good luck charms, curiously enough. Some of the comments even hinted to the imp still being supernaturally active today, adding in the lore that the imp is supposed to come alive on moonlit nights and flit around the cathedral trying to find a way out of its eternal prison. And another claiming that they have heard the imp laughing from its perch up in the angel choir on still dark nights. So, I was excited to get in there and see this legendary critter for myself, and we hurried along hoping that we'd have time to make a quick visit on the way to the castle. We soon rounded the corner of a street that took us into Priory Gate, where we came face to face with the east side of the cathedral, and passed through the triple-arched stone gateway straddling the road and the footpaths either side that gives the street its name. We took a footpath that moved away from the road and cut across the cathedral grounds to get a better peek at some of the incredible stone carvings that decorated every inch of the cathedral. The building is impossible to describe, and equally impossible to get a picture of that would even begin to do it justice. It seemed to sprawl off in every direction, and every time I looked at it from a different angle, I could swear it had sprouted another transept or spire or pinnacle or flying buttress or any of the other things that I barely knew the names to describe. There wasn't a smooth blank wall to be found anywhere. Everything was ornately carved and decorated, and it made me think of an intricately iced wedding cake crossed with a Gothic-style Disney castle. And that may sound like an insult, but it isn't meant to be. The building was just too immense, too ornate, too much to take in, let alone describe. And it was also shut. The heavy doors were firmly closed, and a sandwich board outside declared "Service in progress." Now, technically speaking, it did also say "all welcome," but of course they meant all welcome for the service, not all welcome to go scurrying about hunting for ghosts and imps. So we decided to just crack on to the castle, with the intention of making it back there later. Ah, how hopeful and naive we were. But at least the castle was within a stone's throw away from us at this point. A cobbled street runs along the south side of the cathedral and through Exchequer Gate, a 14th century arched walkway where local tenants would have once come to pay rent to the church. Beyond this archway, the same cobbled street runs west to the gates of Lincoln Castle, only interrupted by the streets of Balegate, Drury Lane, and the very aptly named steep hill emptying out into the cobbled area equally aptly named Castle Hill. And it's in this very place that we find our first ghost story. Back in 1992, a young man was trudging home from his night shift up the silent, empty length of steep hill in the early hours of the morning. His weary footfalls on the cobblestones were the only sound to break the quiet of the deserted streets as he came out onto Castle Hill, heading for Balegate. When all of a sudden, well, one might dare to say, there arose such a clatter, as a steaming black horse appeared from nowhere, galloping along Castle Hill from Exchequer, animal and rider charging past the befuddled man and toward the castle in a whirl of billowing cloak and desperate haste, as the horseback figure screamed out into the shattered stillness of the night, "Open the gate! In the name of the king, open the gate!" The awestruck witness leapt out of the path of this highly unexpected oncoming traffic, only to watch the black horse and cloaked figure vanish into thin air in front of the castle, an eerie silence descending in the wake of the whirlwind phantom. Local legend attributes this spectre to a tale from the days when hangings took place at Lincoln Castle. The story goes that many centuries ago, an innocent man was convicted of a crime he didn't commit and was sentenced at Lincoln Castle to death by hanging. However, friends of the condemned man urgently travelled to London to seek an audience with the king to appeal for a pardon. Happily, they succeeded, but would they make the long journey back from London before the execution? They rode day and night like men possessed, but eventually they had to rest their horses. One of the riders gallantly, or maybe foolishly, volunteered to go on ahead, desperately trying to get back and save his friend. Some variations of the tale say that he too eventually succumbed to exhaustion and had to find an inn to rest in for the night. But his overexertion was his undoing, and he overslept, the dreadful reality hitting him upon waking in the light of late morning that he was too late to save the condemned man. Another version tells that he refused to give in to his tiredness and rode on, but his poor horse, pushed beyond its limits, stumbled and fell, throwing the rider from his back, breaking the man's neck, never to complete his desperate errand. Legend says that the phantom horse and rider is this same guilt-stricken man, still trying from beyond the grave to complete the failed journey that cost his innocent friend his life. This particular apparition seems to be fairly elusive, with only one major sighting on record. But, in Codd's Mysterious Lincolnshire, the author reports that in 2006, a woman took a photograph from the top of Greenstone steps opposite the cathedral, and what came out on that photo was very intriguing indeed. The author describes a swirling mist in the picture that was startlingly reminiscent of the shape of a galloping horse, with what looks to be a rider wearing a cloak billowing out behind. The horse, he says, appeared to be riding in the direction of Exchequer. For us, though, there is slim chance that we will be hearing the clattering sounds of phantom hooves on cobblestones anytime soon. We can barely hear ourselves above the chatter of crowds of people funneling through the archways of Exchequer. And if that wasn't noisy enough, tannoys strapped to lampposts all around the streets are pumping out jolly Christmas music to ruin the atmosphere. Add to the atmosphere. Sorry, did that sound a little bit grinchy? Well, it was all getting a bit too peoply, and as you know, I'm not the most peoply person. And I was starting to wonder why on earth I'd thought this trip was the perfect time to go with the flow and be more spontaneous and generally try to shelve my control freak tendencies for once. Ah well, there was still so much day to come yet. Donning our masks and sharpening our elbows, we plunged through the crowd and stormed towards the castle as quickly as our legs would carry us through the throng. At this point, we couldn't have seen any of the market stalls if we'd tried, at least not without drawing upon my long-retired roller derby skills and hip-checking a few people out of the way. But that was fine. Our time slot to see the Magna Carta was fast approaching after all, and we were hoping that the castle would be a little quieter. Well, we were both right and wrong. The crowds continued to press in on all sides all the way through the castle gate and into the courtyard, which was lined with market stalls emitting the glow of fairy lights and the smells of street food amidst a sea of people and the ever-present din of Christmas chart hits through those annoyingly omnipresent tannoy speakers. It was clear to us now that we wouldn't be listening out of a phantom whispers on the wind at this location, or keeping our eyes peeled for the unexplained flitting of shadows in the battlements. After 2 years of avoiding crowds at all costs, this display of festive fun was an assault on our senses. As the queue spilled out into the courtyard, we thankfully extricated ourselves from the tidal surge of market shoppers, slipping off around the back of the visitor centre to a quiet bench in the shadow of a set of stone steps descending from the back of the ticket office. We sat for a moment, gathering ourselves, reasoning that surely it would at least be quieter than ever in the Magna Carta vault and prison tour of the castle, because everybody was out here in the market. And then, to add insult to injury, as we sat collecting ourselves, the unmistakable strain of Wham's Last Christmas floated out from those insidious tannoys. Having proudly embraced Goblin mode since 2020, we had been the reigning champions of the festive Whamageddon game for an unbroken 2 years straight. And now, having barely stepped foot into December, blammo, straight to Whamhalla. But I was still not put off yet. We had the Magna Carta to see, a Victorian prison to explore, and the whole wall walk with all its haunted towers to enjoy. And later, we'd get to see it illuminated with Christmas lights. And even as grinchy as I was feeling, I still love Christmas lights. So we headed to the visitor centre to pick up our tickets and get directions to the vault. Blissfully, we walked into an oasis of calm emptiness. We had been right about one thing. Everybody was outside. The only souls in the place were us and the ticket desk assistant, who looked faintly surprised to see 2 more living beings inside the building. Now, this was more like it. We instinctively found the rack of postcards and joyfully began choosing a stack to send to our wonderful patrons, something that never fails to raise a few eyebrows amongst the shop staff wherever we go, and we gleefully enjoy taking bets on whether or not they cave and ask on who on earth they're all for. And I was utterly delighted to find that amongst the souvenirs were replicas of the Lincoln Imp. Yes! I was over the moon that I wasn't going to miss out on this treat in one way at least. And how could I resist bringing home a wicked little imp to grin down from the shelves of the coffee studio? Spirits buoyed and recovering nicely from the sensory onslaught of the market, we headed to the desk to show our booking receipt. "OK," said the clerk cheerily, "and so I'll just check. When did you book your tickets? Ah, yes, here we are. Right. So you booked them last week. Oh, OK. Ah, well, you might not know then that the Magna Carta, it isn't here." "Pardon?" "Well, it has to periodically go away for restoration, you see, and we're not allowed to tell anybody when it's going or when it's coming back. It's all top secret and we're not allowed to warn anyone." The cogs whirred a bit in my slightly stunned brain, and I suddenly understood. Of course, such an important document would be vulnerable in transit. Of course, they couldn't. But really? It had to be today? Now, we're not the sort of people to make a fuss in these kinds of situations. We're far too reserved from British upbringing for one thing, and anyway, it wasn't the poor clerk's fault. I felt incredibly sorry for him. Coming into work for however many days it had been gone, knowing that all he had to look forward to was risking the wrath of people who had no idea that the object of their road trip wasn't actually going to be at the end of it. So it's not like we would have got cross anyway, but I could see the unfortunate chap understandably bracing himself for a torrent of displeasure. So I'm not sure if he was relieved or maybe a bit scared when in that moment, after everything that had already gone wrong that day, we just looked at each other and exploded into hysterical laughter. Of course it's not, we chortled to each other with a slightly manic glimmer in our eyes as we went back to the counter to purchase a rolled-up facsimile of the Magna Carta instead, adding it to the collection of souvenirs of things we hadn't actually seen. Now, I said, perhaps a bit too forcefully, where's the prison?
As it turned out, we were already in it. Well, in one of them at least. As with many other castles that have managed to retain their use over the years, Lincoln Castle has housed a prison of some description for centuries. In early years, it would have been the fetid, hellish dungeons that we hear about in medieval history. But by the Stuart era, the castle buildings were leased out to long-term jail keepers who ran the prison like a business, with all inmates having to pay for the questionable privilege of their stay there. No small order having to find money for your incarceration when you're locked up and unable to work. These prisons run by career jailers had a reputation for being awful, overcrowded, unsanitary places, and according to the prison reformer John Howard visiting in 1774 and 1776, Lincoln Prison lived up to that reputation. As a result of the 1774 Health of Prisoners Act and John Howard's scathing report, a new prison building was built, and it's in this T-shaped red brick Georgian building that we're standing now. These days it houses the visitor centre, shop and cafe, with much of the upper floors presumably being given over to office or storage space. We don't see much more of it than this, as the main focus is on the newest of Lincoln's jails, the Victorian prison. We make our way down a chilly corridor, passing through the section of the Georgian prison that continued to be used in Victorian times for the more leniently accommodated debtors, people who owed money and were kept separate from the inmates accused of what were considered to be more serious crimes. This now serves as a passageway into the Victorian wing of the jail, added on in 1848 after the 19th century penal reforms once again found the facilities at Lincoln Jail to be substandard, the report pushing for better conditions for prisoners. Now this may sound very enlightened and benevolent, and some of the people fighting for prison reform certainly were that. But others were only interested in how they could most effectively get prisoners to change their wicked ways and turn away from a life of crime, and they didn't necessarily have the best ideas on how to achieve that, much less recognise that for a great number of convicts, a life of crime wasn't a choice, but a last resort in the fight to survive. A popular reform method at the time the Victorian jail wing was built at Lincoln was the separate system. This was based around the idea that prisons were breeding grounds for career criminals, that felons passed their time by encouraging each other's lawless ways and sharing tips on how to be better thieves and swindlers. So the objective was to divide and conquer. They thought if prisoners were kept completely isolated from one another, they would be forced to spend the silent, lonely time of their confinement reflecting on their ways and finding solace and inspiration in daily prayers. Emerging into the men's prison wing, we're faced with the same bleak clinical rows of cold identical cells that remind us of our trip to Oxford Castle and Prison a few years ago. 3 floors of cell-lined corridors stacked one above the other, either side of a high-ceilinged central atrium, natural light provided by a massive arched window taking up the whole height and width of one end of the building. In the women's wing of the prison, the effect is dulled somewhat as the wing is a little more broken up. The atrium isn't open all the way through, with some of the floor being filled in with glass panels, and tucked away in one corner is the display of a spectacular archaeological find discovered during renovation works on the castle in 2013. When 3 meters below ground, the remains of an ancient Anglo-Scandinavian church was unearthed, along with 7 skeletons dating back to the 11th century, one of which was laid to rest in a limestone sarcophagus, indicating great importance or wealth, as this was not common practice at the time. We were also distracted from the grimness of the prison in this wing, as we happened to bump into someone who shared the same relish for haunted buildings as we did, and got chatting about all the best spooky places to visit around the UK. It's amazing how us haunted history enthusiasts seem to gravitate towards one another. Hi Mick, if you're listening. But in the men's prison, there was nothing to break up the clinical bleakness of the place. The cells were mostly bare, aside from the odd punctuation of a few soulless mannequins hanging vacantly on their stands, displaying some clothing or other of the time. Only a small spare sign at their feet providing any context. I'm not sure if this was a deliberate attempt to truly convey the sense of hopelessness that the prisoners would have experienced, but the overall effect certainly managed to project the notion that this was a place designed to break a person's spirit. Under the separate system, inmates would be kept in isolated cells, not allowed to see each other, not allowed to talk to each other for anything up to 23 hours a day, in complete silence. In some places where the separate system operated, prisoners would have sacks or hoods placed over their heads whilst in transit anywhere, so as not to have the scantest opportunity to interact with another human being. In the exercise yard outside the Victorian jail, the foundations of high dividing walls can still be seen that were intended to keep inmates from mixing, even during the brief respite of getting fresh air. Despite all the Victorian institution's intention for reflect, repent, reform to be the order of the day, the implementation of the separate system was actually a bit hit and miss at Lincoln. But that came with its own problems, such as overcrowding and poorly managed ventilation leading to illness spreading amongst the inmates. It seems like, in some respects, this prison managed to incorporate the worst of both worlds, so maybe it's small wonder that some unhappy souls still wander these cold stone corridors. It seems the women's wing is the most active location, with visitors experiencing mainly female spirits. A woman in white is reportedly seen drifting along, staring fixedly ahead, focused on something that only she can see. The apparition of a former matron is reported to have been encountered rushing through the corridors as though hurrying to the aid of an inmate in distress. And in Haunted Lincolnshire, Daniel Codd relates the experiences of an investigation at the Victorian prison by the Bassett Law Ghost Watch group when they held a séance in the prison in 2003. The séance apparently contacted a spirit by the name of Betsy Potter, and whilst we don't have any more information about what she had to say to the group, Codd reports that the name was researched after the investigation, and the group did indeed discover that a woman by the name of Betsy Potter had been incarcerated at Lincoln Castle, and had died there during her imprisonment in 1886. In other parts of the prison, the unexplained activity speaks to the nasty conditions tolerated during some spells of the prison regime. Visitors experience the unexplained smells of urine and a sickly odour they relate to illness. Characteristically of a haunted prison, some of the common experiences reported are hearing the sound of cell doors slamming, the jangling of keys, and more disturbingly, the muffled sounds of moaning and crying.
Well, although we didn't experience any of those, we did each come across a room that felt a little bit off compared to the others. We had split up by this point and were weaving our way in and out of the cells at our own pace. I came to one of the few cells that weren't basically a bare, empty room, and felt like I'd walked into a wall of weirdness. It was just a room with a line of coat pegs on one wall and a full-length mirror at the other end. Hung on the pegs were all sorts of different replica clothes. Prison uniforms, matron's clothes, cleric's robes, all provided for visitors to try on to immerse themselves in the experience. I questioned myself, wondering if it was simply the slightly spooky effect that a mirror can provide, especially in an otherwise bare and quiet environment, where any little reflective movement can set off the brain's alarm bells. But I didn't think it was just that. The rest of the prison had felt so flat, so empty, and this room felt alive with something. But it wasn't much to go on, so I shelved the feeling. It was only after I met up with Fitz again later that I wondered over it again, when he told me that he might have had something weird happen. Where? I asked. In the room with all the clothes hanging up in it, was the reply. Now that was interesting. But in actual fact, the room he was talking about was not the same room. It was an identical setup, only in the men's wing, whereas I had been in the women's. As he had been approaching the cell with the rack of replica clothes, he'd heard someone in there, hanging the clothes back on a peg. These rooms are small and narrow, the kind of place where if you know someone's in there, you don't follow them in, you wait for them to come out. So that's exactly what Fitz did. Waited patiently for whoever it was to finish looking at the replica costumes, and waited until he realised that no one was coming out, and having had a look to check, there had been nobody in there in the first place. When I went to have a look myself, I found it exactly the same atmosphere as its twin in the women's wing. What was it about these rooms, we wondered? Were the clothes acting as some kind of trigger object? Or was it just that these were the only cells where visitors were really interacting with the environment, creating a weird kind of energy?
Sparse though the displays in the prison wing might have been, there was one exhibit we had to find, as it was the source for one of the castle's most famous ghost stories. And there, tucked away in a nondescript cell, was what we'd come to find: a large glass case containing a stuffed dog. Now, don't misunderstand me, looking at a moth-eaten stuffed animal is not really my idea of fun, but this lurcher was the focus of one of Lincoln's most prevailing legends. At the Westgate corner of Lincoln Castle, not far outside the curtain walls at the bottom of the earthwork, a tall, skinny old building sits stranded amidst a sea of car parks and public toilets, like the lone survivor of an earlier time. Its layered whitewash and red brick frontage and bay windows make it conspicuously old-looking within the otherwise grey uniform concrete of its immediate surroundings. This is the Strugglers Inn, so named because its proximity to the castle meant that on execution days, when the condemned were hung from the scaffold on the top of the castle tower known as Cobb Hall, the patrons of the inn's garden could watch the proceedings with their friends with lashings of beer to lubricate the party atmosphere. As we've discussed on this show before, rather terrifyingly, public executions used to equal public entertainment. The Strugglers Inn is also said to have been the regular haunt of one William Clark, a harsh, unlikable miscreant who regularly took his chances with the law pursuing his favourite pastime of poaching, and whose only true companion was that of his lurcher, from whom it said he was inseparable. The pair could often be found lurking in a corner of the Strugglers Inn of an evening, the dog peeking hopefully from beneath the table, dark eyes on the lookout for tasty scraps. Well, one evening, whilst holed up in their customary spot, 2 policemen came to hold Clark to account over a bungled escape from the gamekeeper of a wood he had been caught poaching in. Clark had shot the gamekeeper in his bid for freedom, and the wound had festered, taking the gamekeeper's limb first and eventually his life. Clark was marched off to the castle and imprisoned, leaving his forlorn dog at the Strugglers' Inn. The poor creature pined for his master and could only keep returning to the inn, scratching and whining at the door for scraps and the dim hope of finding his master there. But it was never to be, because William Clark had been sentenced to death by hanging and would never emerge from the castle again. On the day of Clark's execution, patrons of the Strugglers watched the dog become more and more agitated until, at the time Clark was scheduled to take the long final drop out of this life and into the beyond, the lurcher threw back his head and gave a blood-curdling howl. The locals were convinced that the dog had somehow known the moment of his master's passing, and he became somewhat of a local celebrity. The landlord of the Strugglers more or less adopted the dog, but the lurcher continued to pine for his master until the day he died. Having worked his way into the hearts of the landlord and patrons of the inn, after the lurcher passed away, the landlord had him stuffed and kept the dog in a glass case behind the bar. We may think this quite strange now, but back then it was often an expression of affection, and until it was donated to the Castle Museum in the 1980s, the stuffed dog remained at the inn, in more ways than one. The lurcher might have passed away, but that didn't stop the landlord and his wife hearing the sounds of a dog scratching at the door at night. Nor did it stop them hearing the sound of whining and the occasional soft bark at the door of an evening, although upon opening the door and looking for the source of the sound, there was never anything to be seen. And on some quiet nights when most of Lincoln is sleeping, the occasional witness, wending their way home in the wee hours, has seen the figure of a skinny lurcher skulking around outside the walls of the castle, and maybe they try and ignore the little chill that runs through their bones at the sight, until the strange ethereal-looking dog throws back its head and emits a long, blood-curdling howl.
To be truthful, I was a little relieved to be done with the prison as we headed back towards the Georgian wing. Even if it did have a few claims to fame from having been used as a filming set for Downton Abbey and Call the Midwife, all it conjured up for me was bleakness and hopelessness of the concept of the separate system. But in that respect, the worst was yet to come, because the other thing that Lincoln Castle is pretty famous for is having the last remaining example of a separate system chapel in the world. Going to the chapel for prayers and sermons was pretty much the only thing to break up the otherwise long, silent days of inmates under a separate system regime. But its designers went to great lengths to ensure that these trips to the chapel wouldn't provide any respite from the grim isolation. So they designed a particularly chilling seating arrangement for the pews. The seats curved in a tiered horseshoe shape around the pulpit, rather like the stalls of a theatre, only with none of the fun. They constructed locking walls between each seat, creating high-sided, claustrophobic isolation booths, meaning that despite inmates being squeezed in right next to each other, they could neither see nor speak to another living being in that chapel, except for the chaplain in the pulpit. The inmates would file in one by one and be locked into their individual stall by a warder. And if you think this sounds spectacularly grim, then let me assure you that seeing it in real life only confirmed this. Climbing a narrow, winding staircase brought us out into the highest point of the tiered stalls. From this vantage point, at the back of the booths, in the dim light afforded by the overcast winter afternoon sun filtering weakly through the high windows, the stalls were full of shadows, and we didn't get a proper view of them until we started to gingerly descend the central steps towards the pulpit. Of course, the chapel is said to be haunted. I mean, how could it not be? And we half braced ourselves for the sensation of someone unseen slowly brushing past us in the narrow space, as other visitors have reported experiencing. They have also reported some kind of apparition lurking in the stalls, and for a moment there we could have been mistaken for thinking that we were having a similarly frightening encounter, but no, it's something even worse. As we look into the pews to the left and right of us, we realise that certain booths contain the horrifying spectre of blank-faced mannequins. As if the place wasn't already dreadful enough, we climbed up into the pulpit, having been told that this is the place to get the best view, although I was becoming less and less certain by the second that I wanted to, and reaching the top we were faced with a sea of mannequins, all half swallowed in the shadow of their horrid little claustrophobic pew cells, the dim light and shadows only serving to bring their pale faces to life as my brain automatically tried to recognise human expression in their vacant faces. And of course, there was one in particular. There's always one who looked for all the world as though he was about to lurch out of his slumped position in the pews and spring to life. Despite myself, I actually felt like I was ready to face the crowds again. Even the din of wham over the dreaded tannoys was preferable to this nightmare fuel. So, rather gratefully, we headed back outside into the melee.
Having visited the parts of the castle that required a timed ticket entry, we were now free to explore the grounds and rather epic wall walk that completed the whole 1/3 of a mile circumference of the curtain wall. We did have separate tickets to the illuminated wall walk experience later on when the sun had set and the Christmas lights would be on show, but we first wanted to see it in daylight to take in the views of the city from the battlements, and of course to explore the haunted towers. Showing our passes at the gated entrance, we were directed to a creaky metal spiral staircase. Why do these things always sound like they're about to have some kind of epic structural failure? We proceeded to wind our way up and up and up until we emerged on an equally creaky landing that bowed worryingly under our feet. We scurried onto the mercifully solid, thick 12th century stone curtain wall and paused to take in the scene below. From up here, away from the undulating mass of Christmas shoppers, the market looked much quainter and more appealing. The lights twinkled, the stalls glowed warmly, and the festive hubbub became softly atmospheric now that we were far removed from it in our lofty position over the castle's east gate. The roofs of the various wings of the prison jumbled together to the left of us, and to the right, the curtain wall, punctuated by mismatched towers, stretched off into the distance. Lincoln isn't a neatly symmetrical castle, and with good reason, as the towers weren't all built at the same time. From our starting position, we're actually travelling backwards in terms of tower history, and heading towards the most recent one first, Cobb Hall, the same tower that once held the long drop scaffold. The reason it's called Cobb Hall is thought to have been discovered during repair work to the castle in the 19th century, when a surveyor discovered and recorded 200 cobs, or stone cannonballs, that had been stored in the tower. These would have been loaded into trebuchets, the huge wooden catapults used to hurl ammunition over castle walls during sieges. We know that trebuchets were used to attack Lincoln Castle in the 13th century from a record that describes an engineer in the midst of loading cobs into the catapult, who was stopped dead in his tracks, quite literally by a knight on horseback, cutting his head off with a swipe of his sword. In fact, Lincoln Castle saw its fair share of sieges, and 2 of them in particular take us right back to where we started. Yep, that darn Magna Carta again. We just can't seem to get away from it. But here we also meet one of the most intriguing characters in Lincoln Castle's history.
We're used to hearing tales of how medieval women were basically ruled and owned by their husbands. Even if they were wealthy heiresses who did inherit lands, their property was often managed by their husbands or an appointed male deputy. But at Lincoln, we find an extraordinary woman inextricably linked with not only the history of the castle, but the history of all of Britain. Nicola de la Haye was the eldest daughter of a wealthy Norman, whose mother had been a Lincolnshire heiress. When Nicola's father died, she inherited his Lincolnshire lands and his position as castellan, or governor of Lincoln Castle. Nicola was married twice during her lifetime, and on paper she was subject to the same restrictions that other medieval women were burdened with. But in practice, somehow Nicola managed to have a lot more control in her marriage and over her property, and had a long and active career as Sheriff of Lincoln Castle. In 1191, Lincoln Castle came under siege during a power struggle between King Richard I and his younger brother John. Nicola and her second husband Gerard supported John's challenge to the crown and refused to give up Lincoln Castle to the King's Chancellor William Longchamp, who was leading the King's campaign. Gerard rode to Nottingham to support John, leaving Nicola in sole charge of Lincoln Castle. But in response to their refusal to concede to the crown, Longchamp laid siege to Lincoln Castle. Nicola held the castle without her husband or a deputy throughout a 40-day siege, winning her place in the history books and the eternal favour of the future King John. The stunt lost them the castle for a time, though, after King Richard returned to England, as obviously he was none too happy with the royal side that they had picked. But when John succeeded to the throne in 1199, he remembered who had had his back during his challenge to his brother and reinstalled Nicola and Gerard at Lincoln Castle. In 1215, Gerard died, leaving Nicola a widow once more, but she doesn't seem to have been forced to remarry, something which her advancing age may have helped protect her from, as by now she was in her 60s. Instead, she took on responsibility of castellan from her husband, who had legally held the role despite all of Nicola's accomplishments practicing it. Of course, we already know that once King John succeeded to the throne after the death of Richard I, things were not plain sailing. His abuse of power, increasingly steep and increasingly hated taxes had sparked the uprising of the rebel barons and resulted in King John's forced agreement to the 1215 Magna Carta. But that wasn't quite the clean solution that the barons had been hoping for, because although King John reluctantly signed the Magna Carta, as soon as he was safely away from the enforcing barons, he wasted no time in figuring out how he could get it reversed, and ran off to his mate the Pope to tell him about how the meanie baron bullies had made him sign a contract that he didn't like and could he please get a note to be excused. To which the Pope obliged, and thus the First Barons' War began, as the barons tussled with trying to rein in the uncompromising king. It was against this backdrop that Nicola de la Haye unflinchingly maintained her loyalty to King John. Maybe she truly believed in him as a king. Or maybe she was canny enough to use the fact that John owed her one for her allegiance back in the early days to her advantage. That may make her sound a little mercenary, but she lived in a mercenary world, a man's world, where the freedom and power she held would always be teetering on a knife's edge. In the middle of the civil wars over the Magna Carta, John visited Lincoln Castle, and a spectacle followed that was so unusual and unheard of for the time that it was recorded by contemporaries and made it into the history books. Witnesses described how Nicola walked out of the castle's east gate to meet King John upon his arrival, holding the keys to the castle out in front of her, offering them up to John as her lord and begging him to relieve her of her duties at the castle, as, in her words, she was aged and grew weary. The king is said to have sweetly revoked her pleas, pushing the keys back into her hands with the gentle words, "My beloved Nicola, I will that you keep the castle hitherto until I shall order otherwise." It's not surprising that this made waves. It doesn't seem characteristic of the villainous John for one thing, and for another, for a king to beseech a woman to hold and defend a castle in the name of the king was unheard of. It must have been quite the talk of the taverns. While some historians think that most of this was just a show put on for the onlookers, as a proof to the barons of John's faith in Nicola to defend Lincoln Castle. She certainly doesn't seem to have been the fading old woman she made herself out to be in her speech, and in fact, the siege that would forever secure her place in the history books was still to come. By this time, the rebel barons, not getting anywhere with John, had turned to Prince Louis of France for help with their campaign, and the First Barons' War kicked up a notch as the French prince crossed the Channel with his army and began taking control of strategically important towns of cities of England. By October of 1216, the Civil War was closing in on John, and he was running low on allies and safe havens still loyal to his cause. In the end, it was not far from Lincoln Castle that he met a sticky end, in a month that just went from bad to worse. Having visited Lincoln Castle in late September, John then headed southeast towards the coast to visit King's Lynn, then called Bishop's Lynn, and a place that we have passed many times on our road trips to the coastal towns and villages of Norfolk. His intended itinerary from there was back up towards Lincoln again, and then on to Newark. But this time his baggage train took a different route than that of the King's, for some reason electing to cross the treacherous sands of the Wash, a large shallow bay of the North Sea on the east coast between Norfolk and Lincolnshire. Technically an estuary where several rivers flow into the North Sea, at low tide it's a vast expanse of sand and silt, even today stretching 15 miles across, but historically even further. At low tide, it is theoretically passable, but only to those who know their way around the tides, currents and sucking quicksands. John's baggage train either did not have the knowledge to successfully navigate these, or, according to some chroniclers, were caught out by a freak wave. Either way, most of John's luggage never made it to Lincolnshire and was lost to the treacherous quicksands of the Wash, including the crown jewels. John himself did make it to Sleaford in Lincolnshire, but quite aside from the crushing blow of losing the crown jewels, which surely must have felt like an ill omen for his chances at turning the tide of the Civil War, but by the time he arrived, he was becoming more and more ill. Some contemporaries blame overindulgence for the king's sudden illness, citing his enthusiastic consumption of peaches and pears at his last stop. Others said it was exhaustion from his unrelenting campaign and riding from place to place for hours without rest. Others still suspect that he may have been poisoned. Most historians nowadays cite dysentery as what ailed him, but whatever it was, he had to be carried by litter to his final destination of Newark, where, on the 18th of October 1216, with what may have been one of his dying breaths, he named Nicola de la Haye as official sheriff of Lincoln Castle, just hours before succumbing to his mysterious illness. Nicola did not take this appointment lightly. And so, when Prince Louis of France's troops besieged Lincoln Castle once more the following year, by which time King John's young son Henry had succeeded to the throne, she held fast, enduring 3 months of siege, the town of Lincoln having been taken by the opposition, and only the castle standing fast in the name of the king. At last, relief came in the form of the Royalist army, headed up by the Earl of Pembroke, as the troops marched to Lincoln in what would become a key battle in British history. Entering the city of Lincoln from the north and west, they succeeded in beating the rebels back from the castle and out of the city, the French forces eventually retreating down Steep Hill. I find it odd that the Battle of Lincoln hasn't appeared on my historical radar before now, and neither has Nicola de la Haye. In school, it's drummed into us how the Battle of Hastings changed the course of British history. We recited the names of William and Harold until they were indelibly imprinted on our brains. But many historians argue that this battle was just as crucial, and that if it hadn't have been for Nicola's refusal to surrender Lincoln Castle to rebel forces, allowing Royalists to retake Lincoln and turn the tide of the Civil War, then in all likelihood the French rebel alliance would have prevailed, and the history of England would have taken a completely different course. Well, even if the history books often don't remember this decisive battle, the streets of Lincoln certainly do. According to David Brandon's Haunted Lincoln, witnesses have reported hearing a strange cacophony of unexplained noise that they have described as sounding like an old-fashioned battle. There are also claims that visitors have seen ghostly figures in battle dress, and some even claim to have witnessed phantom battle reenactments. But what of Nicola? What was to be her reward for preserving the king's hold on England, for years of unfailing loyalty, for enduring months of siege involving unrelenting assaults and likely attempts to starve her and her forces out of the castle? Well, she got sacked. Yep, in possibly the most ungracious response to saving a king's behind that was ever doled out. 4 days after the Royalists' army's success at the Battle of Lincoln, the role of sheriff and the castle were taken away from her and given to the Earl of Salisbury. Well, I don't know about you, but I would be fuming. She did not give up, though, and after appealing to the king, she was at least given the castle back, although Salisbury remained in charge of the county, and spent the rest of his life trying to wrestle the castle out of Nicola's grip. But she had the last laugh, because she outlived him, finally getting to enjoy her last years in peace, her beloved castle firmly in her grasp, before passing away in her late 70s in the year 1230. Truly an astonishing woman.
Making it to the top of Cobb Hall, it's impossible not to be awed by the views across the city. The daylight's fading, and in the growing dusk, the streets are lit up with Christmas lights, people hustle and bustle merrily through the market stalls, and our view of the cathedral is made even more incredible as the lights come on and the impossibly grand building is bathed in a regal purple glow. But amongst all this jollity, there's the nagging reminder that we're standing on the tower that used to hold the gallows. This is where William Clark would have taken his last look at the city below him before he took the long drop. And this is where visitors have reported hearing strange creaking sounds that have conjured to their minds the creaking of a body gently swaying from the gallows. One man, whilst walking across one of the car parks at the base of the curtain wall early one autumn morning, reported hearing the inexplicable sounds of a crowd cheering and jeering. Could this have been an echo of the crowds that gathered around the castle on execution days to watch convicts hang? But the most famous ghost of Cobb Hall is an even more sinister phantom. The story involves a family with a young son who were exploring Cobb Hall one day. In spite of the fine vaulted ceiling and the upper level of the hall, leading experts to believe that it may once have been used for ceremonial purposes, the lower level is accessed by a hatch in the floor, and graffiti etched into the walls and a 19th century record that army deserters had once been confined in the space have led to the assumption that it had, at one time, been a dungeon. And it was into this crypt-like space that the young son was peering, when his horrified father witnessed a strange lady in black materialise and attempt to push his son down the narrow wooden steps into the vault below. Thankfully, the father managed to grab his son and stop the fall. But who was this strange woman in black? And why was she lingering with malintent around the basement of Cobb Hall? And the other question is, how do we get into the tower to investigate it? We peer over the railing to the bottom of the tower, taking in the massive carved stone dragon's head that sprouts improbably from the curtain wall below us. Yep, okay. There's a door into Cobb Hall at the base of the tower. So, how do we... At this point, we notice that the entire area in front of Cobb Hall is roped off. The Christmas market huts run in a long line across the edge of the grass slope leading up to the tower, and any access behind them is blocked off for the security of the market traders. So there is to be no access to Cobb Hall for us today. Another one bites the dust. Well, we still have a couple more towers and a great deal of wall left to explore, so we walk on, accompanied by occupants of the large brightly lit fairground Ferris wheel just outside the castle, whose revolving carriages keep popping up at eye level to the battlements in a rather disconcerting manner. Beyond the west gate, we traverse a stretch of wall that has us peering over the battlements into people's back gardens. We're more used to visiting castles in the countryside out in the middle of nowhere, where the nearest neighbours are often a family of ducks. It's more rare for us to visit a castle in such a built-up and developed area, so it's a bit of a shock seeing regular-looking houses nestled closely to the base of the castle earthworks. Their back gardens run right up to the moat, and I have to wonder to myself how many residents of these properties have looked out of their back windows at night and seen a strange ethereal figure stalking the battlements after hours.
Our next stop is the oldest tower of the castle, the Lucy Tower, which still stands on the original Norman motte. This is a bit of an odd one, as these days the tower is just a shell. There's no roof, and the polygonal keep is open to the sky. And inside is a small garden with an elderly tree at the centre. In fact, the keep has been derelict since the early 19th century, so rather than waste the space, those canny Victorians thought up a use for it and turned it into a graveyard. Execution by hanging still took place at the castle until 1859, and, well, they needed somewhere to bury the bodies. So, this small garden in the shell of the Norman keep became the final resting place for hanged convicts and several unfortunate inmates of the prison who died during their incarceration. The small, plain gravestones are still visible as we enter the tower, and, mercifully, spot only the second bench to be found in the whole of the castle grounds, eager to rest our legs for a moment. It felt quite peaceful in there, the wind gently ruffling the feathery dark green needles of two great yew trees standing sentinel at the far side of the graveyard. We listened closely for the disembodied sounds of moaning and sobbing that are often reported here, but sadly, the peace was soon shattered by the high-pitched whir of a low-flying police drone cutting through the air above us, obviously monitoring the market below. We sigh a little, but it's still been quite the experience. I can honestly say that I'd never been in a graveyard inside the tower of a castle before. And that leaves just one more haunted tower to explore, and this one has a haunting that was experienced as recently as 2004. The Observatory Tower was built not long after the Lucy Tower, on the second of Lincoln Castle's Norman mottes. But the defining feature that gives it its name is actually a quirky little crenellated turret that was only added in the early 19th century. It's widely believed that this was built to indulge the keen interest in astronomy of the prison governor John Merriweather. And this, along with the fact that it was used as a lookout point by air raid wardens in the Second World War, cemented the name of the Observatory Tower in castle history. Apparently, it's not unusual for people climbing the narrow, winding stairs up to the top of the tower to see people walking ahead of them, only to find that when they emerge at the top, there's no one else there, and nowhere that anyone could have disappeared to without having passed them coming back down. In April of 2004, a couple and their 2 children were on a day out at the castle and started up the stairs of the Observatory Tower when both adults started experiencing a chilling feeling. The mother started to get a headache and began to feel quite ill and uneasy, not wanting to continue up the tower. Her daughter also showed reluctance to continue the climb. The couple didn't mention what they were experiencing to each other at first, only discovering later on that despite the warm day, they had both felt the temperature plummet as feelings of unease washed over them. As it happened, the husband had snapped a picture inside the tower, a memento of their day out, and maybe something else. As when the photo was developed, a strange, misty shape appeared that was not present on any of the photos he had taken of the same spot before or after the one in which a ghostly mist had materialised. This should be interesting. I wondered if we would feel anything off or untoward about the observatory tower, and I'm still wondering that now, because when we got there, the door was locked. At this point, I felt like we must hold some kind of record for the most failed visit to Lincoln. Well, I suppose that most people visiting the castle today were sensible enough to have only come for the light show. And at least we had thought to book tickets for the illuminated wall walk, which, now I think about it, having just traversed the entire length of it, where were the telltale lights of this festive illumination? I don't really remember seeing anything much in the way of... Oh. My eyes alighted on what looked like a bit of rope strapped to the safety barrier that I now recalled having seen on every section of the wall as we'd made our way along. The penny dropped and I realised that this was the illuminations. One single strand of rope light running along the edge of the wall. Ah! My thoughts turned, as they always do when I've plumb run out of size for the day, to the comfort of a cheese sandwich stashed away in my backpack for moments just such as this. "Shall we just go down and have something to eat?" I suggested, as the light waned and, halfway down the rickety stairs, the single rope light popped into life, confirming our suspicions that the wall illuminations were to be less illuminating than the 10 fairy lights we had wrapped around our straw Yule goat on the dashboard of the coffee-mobile.
And so, with night rapidly falling, we found the only other bench in the whole castle for a few moments of respite, which just happened to be opposite the entrance to the curtain wall, even though we'd paid extra for separate tickets to experience the illuminated wall walk, having literally only just finished it, admittedly 30 seconds of which had been under the mesmerising glow of that one LED rope light. I felt less than enthused to repeat the experience so swiftly. And if that wasn't enough, We were in prime position to witness just how many other people had purchased tickets to the illuminated wall walk, and whilst Lil fished around in her backpack for her sandwiches, I watched with growing dismay the amassing queue of people lining up at the gate to witness the spectacle of the one rope light. Lil suggested that we take a quick lap around the Christmas market stalls in the castle grounds to both give us time to think about it and, as it was not far from tea time, we had a long drive ahead of us, and I didn't really fancy the by now rather limp cheese sandwiches. We considered the possibility of finding some warm food as well. My stomach concurred, and we had a quick potter about the market. I'll admit that I'm not the greatest in a crowd, and even though the throngs had thinned a little compared to earlier in the day, I still found myself concentrating more on not bumping into people than what was on offer at the stalls. Eventually, though, we came into a slightly more open and less densely packed area surrounded by food trucks. For some reason, most seem reluctant to advertise their prices, which in my experience implies that I will be reluctant to pay those prices, and none of them really seem to have any particular relevance to traditional German food. In the end, a Turkish kebab was about as Christmassy as I could hope for. I've no idea how much it cost, as, like the rest of the stalls, they were quite shy about making the price obvious, and we paid by card, but I must say that it was actually quite nice. I just hope that when the bill comes due that I don't regret it. Refueled, we headed back over to the wall walk stairs, only to find that there was now a queue that stretched out of the castle gates, and the thought of negotiating those rickety landings again with the added weight of that epic queue of bodies for the sake of one LED rope light that we could see perfectly well from the ground was enough to put pain to that idea. We decided that we weren't going to put ourselves through that, and filed the illuminated wall walk amongst the growing list of things we didn't do in Lincoln. Leaving the castle and crossing the short stretch between the castle gates and the cathedral was challenging for me. The crowds here were still thick and hustled and bustled from every angle. The German food stalls were obviously present outside the castle at least, as more than one person bore mighty bratwurst the size of broadswords, and with the crowds of people pressing in and the cacophony of raised voices, it felt for a moment like I could have been in the midst of a medieval melee. Except at least in that case, the enemy would more likely be coming from just one direction. The cathedral is only a very short walk from the castle, and bathed in purple light, it appeared even more fantastical, if such a thing is possible. It even seemed to distort the space around it so that it grew larger than perspective would normally allow the closer we came. A beautifully adorned Christmas tree, perhaps 30 or 40 feet high, stood just outside the entrance, but seemed no bigger than a potted houseplant. I wouldn't have suspected it was quite so tall, were not the people stood around it only barely reaching its lowest branches. I suppressed a feeling of vertigo as I leaned back to try and take in the looming might of the cathedral towers, as Lil struggled to find a way of capturing more than a tiny section of wall at a time in photographs. And then I spotted something. There was some movement on one of the towers, kind of flapping, almost like someone waving to the people below, or struggling to keep their balance. A thought flashed through my mind of a report of groups of school children in October 1964 who believed it was possible to see a white mass floating around the Minster between 7:45 and 8:15 each night, with some even suggesting that it appeared like a flash of lightning from the tower to the ground. I got halfway through a gasp of astonishment before I realised that what I was seeing was in fact a pigeon. Clearly none too impressed with having a few thousand watts of purple light shined at it when it was trying to get some sleep. And I also wondered if this might have been what the school children had witnessed. It was full dark now, and I empathised with the pigeon. Having been on our feet all day, a lie down was sounding very appealing at this point, and we still had a 2-hour drive to look forward to. But even though we weren't going to be able to visit everywhere we had planned to on this trip, there was one more place to visit that we really couldn't miss. Fortunately, it was also very close to the cathedral, and didn't take us far off the path back to the coffeemobile and home. Incidentally, even the route we were taking has its own ghost. Margaret Green, a Lincoln ghost tour guide, reported to the Lincolnshire Echo that on several occasions, independently relayed to her by those taking her tour, her guests had been joined between the Exchequer Gate and the Judgment Porch on the south side of the cathedral by a mysterious lady in white. When the tour reaches the Judgment Porch, she shakes her head and disappears, leaving only the scent of her perfume. If she joined us on our haunted walk, I couldn't say. There were still too many people crisscrossing the road and paths in front and behind us for us to have noticed anyone in particular making an incorporeal exit. Leading sharply downhill from the Judgment Porch to the south of the Minster Yard is Greenstone Place, and where this road ends, leading even more sharply downhill, are the Greenstone Stairs, and this was to be our final haunted location to visit for the day. Where the road and stairs meet, rather considerately, is a bench illuminated by a somewhat wonky Victorian-style lamppost. It didn't take long to see quite how considerate it was for the bench to be placed there, as a sporadic procession of people came huffing and puffing up the stairs, eyes alighting ecstatically on the chance to rest and catch their breath before tackling the remaining climb. I'd seen it reported that it's somewhat of a local pastime to watch visitors climb the steep footpaths of Lincoln, gasping for breath, and I can well believe it. We inspected each breathless climber as they reached Greenstone Place, just in case they turned out to be one of the most famous of the Greenstone ghosts, said to be a 17th century cleric who vanishes through a solid stone wall near the arch at the top of the stairs. Local legend has it that he hung himself from the arch, but little else seems known about him. Looking back up towards the cathedral, we scoured the shadows for the ghost of what was believed to be either a nurse or a nun carrying a baby who is said to haunt Greenstone Place. One witness, having just climbed the stairs and warmed from her exertion, noticed that the temperature suddenly dropped and the world seemed to become distorted to her senses. It was then she noticed the figure dressed in flowing robes and floating several inches above the ground. The witness was frozen to the spot until the figure glided silently into Greenstone Terrace and disappeared, at which point she suddenly regained her senses and fled. Sadly, we saw neither cleric nor baby-toting woman, and the world remained undistorted, aside from an appropriately spooky freezing fog that was drifting in, causing each weary stair climber to emerge through the haunted archway in a shroud of pale hanging mist like so many puffed-out apparitions. There were 2, or maybe just one other ghost that we were here to investigate. Apparently, there are many reports that people walking the Greenstone Stairs will feel phantom hands plucking at their legs, but I wonder if they might not instead be related to the other ghost, or at least part of one that's said to tumble down the stairs and likewise bounce into people's legs. We heard earlier about the calamities that have befallen Lincoln Cathedral over the years, one of which being a mighty earthquake in 1185 that bisected the cathedral top to bottom. This occurred during the tenure of Lincoln's most famous and respected bishop, Hugh of Avalon. There are many tales about Hugh, perhaps none as well known as his swan companion, who followed him everywhere when he was in Lincoln, would eat from his hand, attack anyone who came close, and even guard him while he slept. Hugh was also responsible for the rebuilding and enlarging of the cathedral following the 1185 earthquake, even though he sadly never got to see it completed. After his death, Hugh was interred within the cathedral and would later be canonised in 1220, and is the patron saint of sick children, sick people, shoemakers, and, perhaps unsurprisingly, swans. His canonisation prompted floods of pilgrims to visit the cathedral and his resting place. You'll note that I didn't say final resting place though, as the cathedral decided to capitalise on those visitors by disinterring his body around 60 years after his canonisation, removing the head, and setting both body and head in separate shrines for the pilgrims to view. I'm not entirely sure why they felt it necessary to remove his head, but I suspect that this may have made things easier for the thieves that stole it in 1364. They weren't really interested in the head itself, they actually wanted the jewellery that adorned it, and quickly threw the head itself away. It was later found in a nearby field. Interestingly, Hugh's affinity for animals, and particularly birds, crops up again after his head was stolen. According to Henry Knighton, an Augustinian priest and chronicler, and as detailed in his section of Historiae Anglicanae Scriptores Decem, once Hugh's discarded head came to rest in the field, a raven miraculously appeared to guard the head until it was discovered and returned to Lincoln. I'm sure that you've put two and two together and realised that the part of a ghost seen tumbling down the greenstone stairs and felt bumping into people's legs is in fact a disembodied head, and local legend has now well and truly entrenched the assumption that it is that of Hugh of Avalon bowling into the legs of those using the stairs. We waited for some time, observing those coming up and down the stairs, and there was plenty of mist about, blurring the already murky light from the weak glow of the wonky lamp, but sadly none of it obligingly formed itself into the shape of a ghostly figure, let alone the galloping horse and rider that we'd heard about earlier. And despite giving ourselves rather more exercise than we really needed for the day by descending and ascending the steps for a time in hopes of encountering St. Hugh, neither of us were bowled over by a bouncing head. So with that, we concluded our exploration of the ghosts of Lincoln and made our way back to the coffin-mobile. We trudged slowly back up Greenstone Place, the cathedral looming over us as we huffed and puffed our way back to the top of the hill. We skirted the east side of the cathedral, past the ornately balustraded chapter house and through Priory Arch, braced against the chill in the air and the flow of people still heading towards us and on to the Christmas market. It didn't take too long to get back to the coffin-mobile, and I was glad for it, as that last climb up Greenstone Place had used much of what was left of my endurance, and my feet were certainly ready for a break from supporting me. It took a good few minutes with the engine running to clear the condensation from the windscreen and to take the chill out of the air, giving us time to stow our bags and arrange which layers of clothing might be necessary for the journey home. We set directions for home on the sat-nav, and bid farewell to Lincoln for the day. I had been concerned that with all the road closures that we might be diverted a few times before being able to escape, but it seemed that Google Maps had now taken account of the road closures and it directed us safely out of Lincoln. However, our day had one last trick up its sleeve. As we began leaving the built-up areas of Lincoln, the fog, which had been quite light and sparse on our journey north, was now becoming ever denser. So dense, in fact, that by the time we'd left Lincoln, it was almost impossible even to see the street signs. Thus, we were entirely reliant on the sat-nav to guide us safely home. For some reason, though, it wanted to give us a bit of a thrill in doing so, and failed to take us straight back onto the major A1 road that we'd come on, and instead prompted us to take ever narrower and darker country roads. Or at least I assumed they were country roads. I could see literally nothing around us and very little of the road ahead. And so we drove at a safe, if not a mile devouring pace, eyes fixed on the road and arms clasped taut on the steering wheel, lest an unexpected deal, or even worse, car or truck, should come barreling out of the fog. Using full beams was out of the question, as its only effect was to turn the milky soup into a sheet of opaque white. The roads were single carriageway, twisting and turning, with each corner startling in its sudden appearance. The sat-nav had indeed selected an alternative route to avoid road closures, and to do so it was taking us down every minor back road it could find, and because of our location, this often meant crossing narrow causeways over wet fenland where, of course, the fog crowded in ever more thickly, and visibility was becoming non-existent. We were relying more and more on tracking the route on the sat-nav to tell where the road was about to turn, with Lil issuing instructions like a contestant on that 80s TV game show Nightmare, with a similar feeling of threat that I might be about to disappear into a black void. Right turn coming up, road bears to the left, junction ahead, brace yourself for a hairpin bend. After our tiring day, it was not the most relaxing of drives home. I was white-knuckle gripping the steering wheel, and Lil was getting frazzled trying to co-pilot the car through the sat-nav. Eventually this tiredness led to a wrong turn just as we were getting close to home, and the sat-nav said, "Turn left." "This one," I said, and "Yes, wait, no, the next one," came the reply. But, as I'm sure you've guessed, I'd already taken the wrong turn. Not that it added too much to our journey, but the extra few minutes of tense focus was pretty much the capstone to our day. Eventually, we made it home, weary and sore, and just in time to feed little Fitz, who gave us the cold shoulder for an hour or so afterwards to ensure that we were aware of her displeasure at being left alone for an entire day. Our final duties fulfilled, we sank gratefully into the sofa with a groan, followed by Lil muttering, "Remind me never to leave you in charge again."
And that brings us to the end of our very Christmassy paranormal postcard, Lincoln Castle, a comedy of errors.
Yeah, sorry. That's all I can say. I'm sorry.
It's not actually your fault. I know we've been joking about it because it's funny, but it's you did everything you could. It was just one of those days. And we still saw an amazing castle. We saw some cool stuff. We visited a castle tower with a graveyard in it. It was a cool day out.
We got free tickets to go back as well.
We did.
Because they were very apologetic about Magna Carta not being there.
They were very good about it. They were very professional and very apologetic, and they immediately gave us free replacement tickets so that we can go back and see the Magna Carta when it is at home. Indeed.
And the guy that came behind us.
Yeah, we laughed hysterically, but the chap that came in after us had only come to see the Magna Carta, and he was not pleased.
No, he was not a happy bunny. So yeah, after our trip to Lincoln, like I say, we've got free tickets. Not sure if we're going to go back because
we are.
We're going to have to.
We are.
So you may get a follow-up. I don't know if it's going to be a follow-up
episode.
In
the towers.
If we see ghosts in the towers, then yeah, it's definitely going to be a big
Obviously.
deal. But we'll do our best to update you on if anything happens and if we do finally get to see the Magna Carta.
But we will not be going when the Christmas market is on, will we, Fitz?
We will not. Sorry.
And with all that said, we cannot possibly end the Christmas special episode without Christmas crackers.
No,
you knew it was coming.
No, well, people have been asking us for it.
Yeah.
The last episode, they went, "Is this the one with the crackers in?" And I was like, "No, it's the next episode."
This is the crackers
one.
So
this is the cracker episode.
Brace yourself.
Brace yourself.
Some terrible jokes. Are we going to pull both at once?
Oh, I think we might have to.
Okay, right, ready? Oh, at least
we won one each.
Woo-hoo!
That's fine. That's good.
What did you get? Hang on. That's a pen. Oh, that's actually really handy.
Oh, I've
Cool.
got a tiny, tiny pack of cards.
Oh, these are good crackers. Oh,
A bit posh.
bit posh. Paper hat.
Yep, I've got a red paper hat.
I've got a green standard paper hat. Oh, see, I'm busy faffing around putting it on and I haven't found my joke.
Well, we haven't got a camera on, so nobody can see. So
But you can hear,
I've
they
put
can
my
hear
hat
the
on
rustle.
already.
No, he hasn't. He's lying, listeners.
I can't. I've
He's
got
not-
headphones on.
He's not wearing his hat, and I can't find the joke.
Okay, are you ready for a terrible...
I got a second prize.
You got 2 prizes in yours.
I got a double prizer.
Oh, wow.
I know. I still can't find the joke. It's literally gone.
Did you get a second prize instead of the joke?
I think I did. Oh no! Wait.
Oh, you got one.
Oh, I found it. Oh, disaster over. Okay.
Okay, brace yourselves, people, for the terrible, terrible joke. Why does Father Christmas go down the chimney?
Oh, I don't know why.
Because it soots him.
Oh my goodness. Right. Okay. What is green, covered in tinsel, and goes ribbit, ribbit?
I hesitate. I don't know. I'm not sure I want to know.
A mistletoe. I wish I could remember the Lincolnshire name for frogs that we were talking about earlier. It's already got out of my head.
Something organ, wasn't
Something organ, yeah.
it?
Well, there you go. It's now properly Christmas. We've had a dodgy Christmas quiz. I'm wearing a silly party hat, and we've had some terrible jokes.
Yep, that brings us to the end of another episode of Not Once for Yes, and in fact, a whole other year. I'm not quite sure where it, or in fact the previous one went, and I'm kind of terrified I'll wake up tomorrow and it'll be 2020 all over again. Thank you so much for joining us over the year, and we very much hope that 2023 is going to be a better year for everyone. Thank you for chatting with us on social media and for sharing your stories with us. And please do get in touch if you've had a paranormal experience that you'd like to share at notonceforyes.com. A huge thank you to our patrons, Coffee and Repod supporters, without whom we wouldn't be able to do what we do. We know that you understand how much effort goes into producing the show, and it's truly humbling, reassuring and heartwarming that you support us in producing the show every month. And don't be a stranger, hop into our Discord and join us on the Patron Zooms for a chat and a bit more of a peek behind the curtains of what we do. If you're not currently supporting the show and would like to, you can do so by becoming our patron from as little as $1 a month, becoming a member on Repod, or making a donation through Coffee, the links to all of which can be found on our website. It all helps keep the show running and without filling the show up with sponsors and advertising, and hopefully one day it'll be enough to allow us to work on the show full time. We know that not everyone can afford to support us financially, but if you do still want to help out, then please do rate and review the show on your podcast player of choice, subscribe on our YouTube channel, share the podcast with your friends, drop our name whenever you see people looking for a new paranormal podcast, and perhaps most importantly, keep sharing your paranormal encounters with us. Not Once for Yes is produced by my production company Narrative Audio, and if you have a podcast and would like to outsource your editing and post-production, then please do get in touch either through Not Once for Yes or narrativeaudio.com. We hope you enjoyed this episode and that you'll follow the path of weird with us again next year for some more spooky stories and haunted history on the next Not Once for Yes.
And finally, Happy Christmas.